This is a memory that I have about my family going to the hospital in which I was about to be born. I recently started thinking about this memory again for some reason. It's just something that I cannot find a logical explanation for, considering that I'm a hyper-skeptical guy. The memory is seeing my dad and other family members walking their way out of my grandma's house, where we used to live, to see my mom give birth, my birth, at the hospital. I can perfectly recall how my dad was dressed that day. For the rest of my family, it's kind of a blurred image. My dad was wearing a black blazer and blue tie with pink diagonal stripes, black jeans, and a lighter blue shirt. I remember even how he was walking while smiling, a pretty detailed and vivid sequence of images. So, as expected a couple of years ago, I might have been 20 at the time, I'm 28 now, I was going to tell him about this weird memory. But before that, I decided to ask him first about how he was dressed the day of my birth, to make sure he didn't just go along with the memory to fool me. And yes, you guessed it, it was the exact same way that I remember. He said he perfectly remembers since he planned it beforehand what he was going to wear for the day of my birth. I freaked out so hard. I would ask myself how this is even possible. It just doesn't make any sense. So I started trying to figure this all out, and I came up with a theory. I later dismissed it, but my family used to record my cousins and I all the time in childhood with this old camera and then put them on VHS tapes. So I started thinking that maybe an uncle of mine or someone else had recorded that moment of my family on the way to the hospital. So I decided to go over all the tapes that I had, plus it's fun watching them. But no, I didn't find anything even remotely close to that image that I had in my mind. Plus, after rewatching my life series on these tapes, I realized they started recording after I turned 1 year old. So, yeah, 1-year-old me tapes were the oldest tapes made, nothing before that. Another thing that I realized, the way that I remember this scene of my family couldn't be recorded in this weird angle and perspective. It was like I was looking at them walking, but also being careful to not be seen. Kind of hiding a little bit behind a wall. Kind of an odd way to record something, right? So that's my story about this weird yet accurate and vivid memory that I have before I was even born. I'm still trying to make sense out of it. Every time I start thinking about it, I can't stop until I sleep. I will start by saying I was a devout skeptic before this experience. It has changed me. It was the summer of 2016, a few months after my sister was born, and my family and I had some old family friends over at our house. We'd been hanging out nearly all day, and it was getting to be around the time of sunset. My friend and I, who I'll refer to as Adam, went on a walk to the ponds in my neighborhood and stayed there for what I remember being about 30 to 45 minutes, just enough time for it to become dark enough to see the stars. At this point, we begin the short walk back to my house when I noticed a star in the sky, which appeared to be moving. I tell Adam this, and he says that he too can see it. At this point, we're standing at the end of my driveway, looking up at the sky. We watch the star for roughly 5 minutes, when we notice 2 other stars, all of which are moving toward each other at around the same speed. Now this is where it begins to get really weird. Adam pulls out his phone and attempts to record it, but it ends up being too dimly lit for his phone's camera to see, sadly. Nearly immediately after Adam had put his phone away, all of the stars had stopped in a blank patch of sky, devoid of all other lights and stars, and formed a large triangle. These lights then began moving as one unit and turning clockwise in the sky. They remained in this formation and movement for nearly 5 minutes before stopping, then proceeded to move at a speed which I've never seen before, away from each other, and disappeared into the night. Based on the reactions of people back at the house, Both Adam and I were visibly shaken up. When we tried to explain what had happened, they shrugged it off, as us just not knowing what we saw. I know what I saw, and so does Adam. Green Cove Springs has a history of military and government establishments and compounds, none of which are currently active. However, there is a significant amount of military infrastructure still in use as housing and places of business. It makes me wonder if this had something to do with some sort of test flight. Either way, we saw what we saw, even if we don't know what it is. When I was little, maybe around 7 or so, I had my first paranormal experience. My mom always told me that she felt like I attracted things from the spiritual realm, even as a baby. But this experience is the first one that is my own memory, and I remember it vividly, now at 26 years old. My mom was unlucky enough to have not only my father die, but also my little sister's father. My dad passed away due to a car accident, and my sister's dad had committed suicide after a battle with severe depression. Needless to say, my mom had it pretty rough, and being a single working mother, she would often take us to a family friend who babysat us while she worked late nights at the hospital. The woman who babysat us was a warm, kind, and gentle woman named Rhonda. She always took the best care of us, and my sister and I really enjoyed staying with her. Rhonda had 2 birds who we loved to talk to. They would repeat simple things like, "Hello" and "What's up?" We thought it was the coolest thing. After a long day of playing, my sister and I were off to bed, and Rhonda tucked me into bed in her spare room downstairs. My sister was still pretty little, and she slept in the same room as Rhonda because she was too scared to sleep alone. And Rhonda was like a grandma to us who was more than happy to share her bed if we got scared. I was a big girl, and I loved having my own room to sleep in. I was never scared. On this night, though, I was having trouble falling asleep, and I just kept tossing and turning, growing frustrated that I wasn't asleep. And for some reason, I began to get anxiety and become fearful. I didn't know why I was scared, but I was. After what felt like forever of me just laying there, contemplating getting up and crawling into Rhonda's bed, I heard something in a low, calm male voice say, "Marissa, it's okay. Just go to sleep." This surprised me, but it didn't scare me. I believe that as a child, you're more open and susceptible to paranormal things, due to the fact that you're not conditioned to be fearful yet. With age, you learn what's scary and all the things that go bump in the night that you should run away from. But I was still so innocent that I didn't register this as threatening at all. Actually, it calmed me down, and I started to feel very tired, and I just accepted what the voice told me and went to sleep. The next morning, Rhonda made us breakfast as she always did. She sat across from me and sipped her coffee. I always asked her for a sip of it, because if I wasn't already a strange child, I also had a taste for coffee. She asked me how I slept, and I told her that I was scared, but that somebody had told me to go to sleep. She looked at me confused, and she asked me if I had had a dream that somebody was talking to me. But I told her, no, I was awake. She said it was probably the birds talking again, and I told her I was sure that it wasn't. She then asked me if it was a man's voice or a woman's voice, and when I instantly said it was a man's voice, her face changed from the usual cheery, warm expression to put off and uncomfortable. I had never seen her face look like that before, and I think that's why I remember this so vividly. She very quickly changed the subject, and we went about our day, and I didn't think about that again for years. Fast forward into my teens, my mom and I were having a discussion about the paranormal, because I had had a lot of strange activity happening. She asked me what the very first experience I remember was that I thought was paranormal. I shared the story about the man's voice at Rhonda's house and how odd Rhonda's reaction had been. My mom looked at me and her eyes widened a bit. Rhonda had gone MIA a few years later, and unfortunately, she just slowly lost contact with us. Eventually, she was no longer a part of our lives. I hadn't seen her in years. When my mom collected her thoughts, she looked at me and said, "Marissa, you know Rhonda's son died in that room, right?" I did not. I knew she had had a son who'd passed away of a tragic overdose, but I was so young that I had never met him, so I didn't really think anything about it. I looked back at my mom and we just didn't have anything to say. We were both thinking the same thing. If I was hearing a spirit speak to me, there's a good chance it could have been her son. From what my mom said about him, he was very kind and caring, much like his mom. Maybe that's why I wasn't afraid when if he, spoke to me. I'm not saying this is factually what happened, but it does make me wonder. The voice I heard was real, that much I do know. Regardless of who it belonged to, it's sure to me that that much is true. Since that experience, I've had many more, and unfortunately, they got much more sinister as I got older. It got very, very dark for a while, and I witnessed things that you usually only see in horror movies. I still think of this experience often, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Regardless, it's not something I'm likely to forget anytime soon. Years ago, I was living outside of Buffalo, New York, on an old estate on the Lake Erie shore. I rented the carriage house of an old mansion that a doctor and his wife owned. The doctor was a heart surgeon, and they were a well-to-do couple with multiple properties, so they weren't around that often. I liked the solitude of the place, having just gotten divorced, and although the carriage house was slightly decrepit, I loved living there. The mansion overlooked the lake, and my house was closer to the road, off of a private drive that went from one side of the estate to the other. The carriage house had been a servant's quarters for whoever lived in the mansion at the turn of the 20th century. There was an enclosed courtyard outside my door that was bordered by the back of my house, the carriage barn, which had stored carriages back in the horse and buggy days, a row of empty horse stalls, and a brick wall with an entrance to the courtyard. It was a very cool place to live. The rent was cheap, and there was a private 150-foot-long beach that was hardly ever used by anybody but me. But it was very isolated if there was nobody staying in the mansion, and there weren't any close neighbors because all of the houses along the road were big estates, and a lot of the rich people living in the area weren't full-time residents. But I was young and brave, and it was a big estate full of decaying spookiness, and I'm a weirdo that likes that kind of stuff. So I was overjoyed to find the place. One night, I was coming home late, around 1 a.m., from a friend's house. Driving down a street a mile or two from my house, I saw a dark figure up ahead, standing close to the road. I thought that was kind of odd, because it was late at night on a weekday, not exactly party time in the Buffalo South towns. I started to get a little nervous, because the person was standing as if they were waiting for someone to pick them up. As I got closer, I could see they were wearing an unusual black shroud-like thing, long and dark and draped, with part of it wrapped over the person's head to look like a hood. It was similar to someone wearing an abaya or a hijab, only much looser, like a bunch of material just wrapped around somebody's body. It seemed totally inappropriate for what I knew of the people that lived around the area. Nobody ever wore anything like that, and certainly not outside at 1 o'clock in the morning on a weekday. The person was just standing by the side of the road, looking stooped over and old. I slowed down to a crawl as I approached, worried that the person needed help. Maybe it was an older, senile person that had walked out of their house in the middle of the night, confused. When I got close enough to really see the person, she lifted her head and looked my way. And I saw that it was my ex-mother-in-law. I was absolutely, positively sure that it was her. The same gray-brown hair, the same eyes, the same enigmatic smile that had always made me wonder what she was thinking about but never saying. She raised her hand and waved at me. Not a stop and help me wave, but more of a, gosh, it's good to see you wave. That scared the hell out of me, because my mother-in-law had died 3 years previous to when I was driving down that road. I sped up and kept driving, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. But a few minutes later, and a few deep breaths later, I told myself I should go back and take another look. My mother-in-law had loved me. I couldn't imagine her ghost would appear seeking revenge on me for divorcing her son, who had not treated me well, to say the least. I drove in a square by making left turns and went down the same road again, but there was no one there. I was too freaked out to go back to my spooky carriage house with the weird sounds and 100-year-old history, with nobody there but me and the ghosts I was convinced probably inhabited the place. So I drove to the local all-night Greek diner and sat there for an hour, drinking coffee and calming my nerves. When I finally drove home and into the courtyard, I could see that something was wrong. My door was standing open. The glass windows were broken. The door was cracked almost all the way through from one side to the other. Someone had destroyed the door to get into that house. The next day, I found a crowbar in the courtyard, thrown off to the side. The only things I noticed missing from the house were just a few pieces of my clothing, super creepy, a jar of loose change, and a knife from the kitchen. I was just divorced and not exactly rich. I didn't have much worth stealing. It's very scary when someone breaks into the house you live in, all by yourself in an isolated spot. They must have driven right into the courtyard and would have been hidden from view while they broke down the door. I called the cops. They never caught anyone. With all the upset of the break-in, it wasn't until hours later that I remembered having seen my dead mother-in-law waving at me from the side of the road, dressed like the Grim Reaper. I'm convinced that she somehow appeared to delay me from going home, that if I had driven straight to the carriage house, whoever the person or persons were who had broken my solid wood 100-year-old door practically in half with a crowbar might have been waiting there for me, or I could have surprised them, and that things might have turned out very differently for me. I live in a 3-story, 4-bedroom new house. Prior to it being a house, this plot of land was a residential home, and before that, I have no idea. My partner, our young children, and I have lived here since it was built, nearly 6 years ago. I've never felt anything bad or good in this house, except for the bedroom on the top floor. That bedroom was our youngest child's bedroom. It was her bedroom from about 6 months old until about 2 years. She never slept well, ever. She would always wake up during the night, sometimes crying uncontrollably. We just put it down to her being a crappy sleeper. However, sometimes if we couldn't settle her back down, we would bring her into our room, which was directly next to her room. She would just sit and stare into the hallway outside and would refuse to be put down near the doorway. And if we tried to carry her out into the hallway to show her nothing was there, she would freak out. She no longer has that room as her bedroom. She shares with her older sisters now. The middle child, a boy, now has that bedroom, and he claims to feel fine in there. However, when it was our youngest daughter's bedroom, she would wake in the night, and my partner would go downstairs to make her a bottle, and I would go in to comfort her. While comforting her with my back to the door, I would always feel like there was something or someone watching me, so much so that I would feel forced to glance back over my shoulder. That's the backstory. During a conversation we were having as a family tonight, myself and my partner were talking to the eldest child, 15 years old, and she just so happened to sleep in her brother's room last night. He was at a sleepover at a friend's house, and she wanted to escape the 2 younger ones. We asked her how she slept, Totally normal question, and we certainly didn't lead her answer in any way. She said, not so great. I felt on edge, like somebody was watching me from the doorway. I wasn't scared, I just felt anxious. How she described her feelings was exactly how I had felt in the past, when I would often be in there comforting our youngest. Neither my partner nor myself have ever spoken to the children about this before, so there's no way she was just regurgitating what we've said. I felt a shiver go up my spine when my stepdaughter said this tonight because it was so accurate. My partner immediately looked at me as if to say, "Wow, that's exactly what we've said." A friend recommended we invest in some selenite to place in and around the room, and we might do that. But I just wanted to share this story and see if anybody else can relate. When I was a young child, about 10 or 11, I moved into a small country town. I've been there before, and my parents grew up there. Everyone who lives there knows that the whole town is haunted, from the school and even the church hall to everything else. And once it goes dark, most people who live there go inside, because you can see spirits walking in dark places, and that's pretty much the extent of it. But the house that I lived in had a spirit who likes to mimic voices, specifically of your loved ones, and even likes to look like them. It would only target me and my older sisters, and only when we were home alone. I would wake up with bruises and scratches, same as my sister. One time I was home alone and heard my older sister call out for me from our room. I got up and saw her walk into our room, just slightly, but I could tell it was her. I called her name, but she didn't answer, so I followed her in. I entered our room and saw that it was empty. I thought that she was messing with me, but she's pretty tall, so there wasn't really anywhere she could hide. Then, suddenly, I heard the front door open. I went and saw my older sister with the rest of my family coming home. She hadn't been there. This wasn't the first time that something like this happened, and it certainly wasn't the last. Fortunately, I moved out of there about 2 years ago, and I've never woken up with a random bruise or scratch ever again. My name is Jordan. I was a young kid of 7 years old when this all started. I have an older sister by 1 year. I'll call her Jess. We were both being raised by my mother. She began a relationship with her boyfriend that we'll name Derek. We moved into a house in West Bountiful, Utah. The house sat near a horse farm, which sat north from the house, away from the road about 50 yards from the back door. The house had 2 wagon wheels buried into the ground halfway for decoration, sitting near the street. We had an elderly lady as a neighbor who lived to the east of us. The next house east was my friend Brian's house. The house was kind of old, but still in good shape. Walking into the front door led you into the living room. The stairs to the right led upstairs, where the bathroom was first on the left, followed by my sister's room to the right, then my mom's room on the left, and my room on the right at the very end of the hall. Past the living room was a kitchen that, to the left, led to the driveway, and to the right led downstairs to another living room. This was adapted into a place where I had my Nintendo 64 set up on a tiny TV. While going down the stairs, there was a crawl space to the right, next to the furnace. Since I was 7, I can't recall how long we lived in this house before things started becoming strange. But to my mom and sister's recollections, the first oddities we noticed was that deep into the night, the toilet would flush randomly. I never noticed this, since my room was farthest from the bathroom, but my sister and mom were both convinced that I was being mischievous and doing it. I do remember them asking me if I really needed to pee last night, but I said that I didn't know what they were talking about, as I hadn't left my room. Weeks later, the toilet flushing became a common occurrence at night. I heard it happen as I was walking to the bathroom one night, so I turned around and went back to bed, obviously nervous. The next day, Derek said it had to be pressure in the sewer causing our toilets to flush. I took his word strongly since I thought he knew all things about plumbing. But the toilet flushing started to become boring, I assume, for after a pause in the activity, the faucets in both the bathroom and the kitchen were both suddenly blasting water out of them. The knobs opened up completely. Derek sprang awake to the sound of rushing faucets and quickly shut them off. After he turned off the kitchen faucet and was walking back upstairs, the toilet flushed as he passed by the bathroom. I slept through this entire ordeal, but my mom said that it pissed him off so much he actually kicked the bathroom door. The faucets joined the toilet in becoming a common plaything at night, and all of us felt pretty uneasy about it. I'm not sure in which order the next parts of the story should go, but all of this happened in the span of about a year, 6 months into living in that house. My friend Brian came over, and we were playing Smash Bros. On my Nintendo 64 in the basement. After several matches, he needed to use the bathroom, so he got up and ran up the stairs. I kept playing. He came running down the stairs. I thought he was excited to keep playing, but he stood there next to me, breathing heavily. His eyes were as wide as dinner plates. He stumbled over his words and asked if there was something wrong with my bathroom. Before I could say anything, he starts frantically explaining that the toilet flushed right before he got to the door, and that as he was done and was leaving, the faucet turned on full power right behind him. I told him that that's happened many times before, but only at night. Brian wanted to go back home after that. He didn't even look back as he walked down the street. I was sad. I was sure that Brian wouldn't want to hang out anymore after the house had scared him. This was, from what I recall, the first time that somebody from outside the house experienced its oddities. I told my mom about it, and she said that it was strange it had happened in the daytime. There were other times that my sister and I would stay weekends with our dad, every other weekend usually. On one of these weekends, my mother and Derek were in bed. She can't recall what time at night it was, but out of her sleep, she could hear the soft sobbing of a woman. She laid there half asleep, wondering if she had left the TV on in the living room. But the sound wasn't coming from downstairs. It seemed to be coming from the room they were sleeping in. The sobbing became more pained and louder. Derek bolted awake, thinking that my mom was hurt. But then they both just sat there in silence as the sobbing turned into a cry of unimaginable pain, as if the woman was either being tortured or in pain of losing a child. Derek quickly got dressed, saying that the neighbor lady next door might be hurt and might need help. He ran out the front door and over to the neighbor's house, but by the time he got to her door, there was no screaming or crying. He slowly walked toward the house, and the crying got louder. There was no mistake that it was coming from our house. Derek checked every square inch of the house when he got back, but there was no one in it except for him and my mother. As soon as it had appeared, it stopped. My mom says that that was one of the hardest nights' sleep in her entire life. One that I was present for happened about a month after the night of the crying woman. It is, of course, the dead of night, and we're all sleeping in our rooms. Suddenly, my mom and Derek were awoken by a blinding light, as bright as a lighthouse. My mother and Derek sprang up and tried to find the light switch in the house, but as they flipped it on, the light stayed. Derek thought it was a semi-truck shining its brights through their window, but as he opened the window, he realized that their window faced the horse farm. They had no window facing the streets at all. As soon as he spun back around from looking outside, the light died out. I remember the commotion afterward. Derek was running all over the house in a panic. He checked the fuse box, grabbed his tools, and tore apart their light fixture at 3 a.m., trying to find any logical explanation and shouting in frustration the entire time. My mother would stay up late most nights. She loved her horror movies and crime shows, so she'd watch them while we were asleep. It wasn't far from midnight when my mom heard the voices of children giggling. The only light on in the house was the TV. She assumed that my sister and I were trying to scare her, so she pointed at the stairs and said, "Both of you, go to bed now." The giggling continued for a little longer before my mom stood up and marched up the stairs, but no one was there. The giggling, though, was getting louder. She finished climbing the stairs and opened my sister's door, only to find her fast asleep in her bed. She checked into my room and found me the same way. After she went down the stairs again, the giggling finally stopped. My mom claims that afterward, she sat there and thought of the woman crying for a while before this occurrence, and thought that these children giggling had some morbid connection. My mom caught the elderly neighbor one morning in her driveway and asked if she knew anything about our house. The lady said she lived on that street for half of her life and never heard or saw anything bad happen inside of the home. Just families moving in and out over the years. We never looked further into this theory. The time passes, and we now refer to our ghostly friends as the kids and the lady. The kids loved to play around in mine and my sister's rooms. They'd open and close our closets, slam my sister's hope chest to startle us, and still loved to play with the toilet at night. Of course, now being 8 years old, I had a constant, uneasy feeling in that house. My mother would assure me that our ghosts were a happy family that needed a place to stay, but this didn't settle my fears at all. I had grown accustomed to having multiple light sources in my room: a lava lamp, 2 plasma balls, and a fiber optic light. All of them were on the headboard of my bed, and I needed these on at all times to feel comfortable enough to sleep. When they were on, I never had anything bad happen in that room. My mom and Derek understood that I needed them on, and never touched them while I slept. But, from time to time, I would wake up and find that some, if not all of my lights had been switched off. Not just the power strip they were plugged into, but the little manual clicky knobs on the wires themselves had been turned off. I'd usually wake up late into the night to pitch darkness and scramble out of fear to get all of my lights back up and working. One night, after turning them all back on, I noticed the closet door, which had been closed when I went to sleep. It was wide open, but that was all. The next part is rather hard for me. Even as I tell this story now, I have goosebumps all over. I had a very gruesome dream that I could only describe as a horror that no young boy could ever dream of on his own. I was sitting in a room in the house in dress clothes, and I was crying. Loud bangs to the door of the room and a hellish scream echoed through the empty room, and I huddled into a corner and screamed. The room went dark with a shadow as the door opened. I couldn't see what was in the doorway, but I kept screaming for whatever it was to stay away. Silence fell. For what seemed like an hour, I sat there in the corner staring at the blackness of the door. Suddenly, people came walking through the shadows. They were all of my family, from my mom and dad to my sister and even a couple of cousins. I didn't leave the corner to greet them. They all just stood there, staring at me with pale faces and glazed eyes. My sister smiled eerily at me and would take stiff steps toward me. I would scream, and she would step back and giggle. My dad walked up to me, towering over me. As he knelt down to my level, his eyes went from glazed and dull to being a void of darkness with small glints of light for pupils. I cowered in fear, turning my head from him. He then grabbed the top of my head and forced me to stare him in the face. Then he said, "You have to say your goodbyes or they're going to be lonely in heaven." Jess screamed in a shrieking voice as my dad grabbed me by my ankle and held me upside down. I was equal height to his face now, and I could see all of the faces of my relatives at that moment. They all had the same eyes as my dad, but had gaping and bleeding mouths, almost like their jaws had been nearly torn off. They all chanted the word heaven over and over as they carried me into a living room where a bed was set up. In the bed was a corpse. It was my sister. Still held by the ankle, they held me above her corpse. I remember every detail of her face. Her skin was olive green and white. It was cracking in places, and her eyes were cold and cloudy and lifeless. I stared at her face in shock and disbelief. One of her eyes moved and stared back at me, before she suddenly sprang from the bed and wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into the bed. She screamed and shrieked as she wrapped her rotting fingers around my neck and began to choke me. I screamed with my last breath for somebody to come to my rescue, but at the last moment I saw my sister placing her thumbs over my eyes and pressing in. I felt the pain of my eyes popping, and all I could do was scream. I was suddenly woken by my mother. I was apparently shouting in my sleep and flailing uncontrollably for several minutes before she got me to open my eyes. Not to my surprise, my lights were all off. I could barely see my mom's face as she held my head in her arms. I was in complete shock. I was shaking violently, unable to speak, darting my gaze over every inch of the room, looking for the demons that nearly had me. I struggled to grab my mom's arm and stuttered, asking where Jess was. At that moment, Jess, who had been awoken by the noise I was making, flipped on the light as she walked in. Upon seeing her, I broke into a nervous breakdown. I tried to crawl away from her, still choking on absolute terror and unable to scream. I grunted and wheezed at her, tears pouring down my face like a waterfall. My mom told Jess to go back to bed. Jess left the room, and my mom asked me if I wanted to stay the night in her bed. I couldn't answer. I was still in shock. She picked me up out of the bed and took me into her room and put me in the spot next to her. She threw blankets over me and said to try to get some sleep. I laid there, shaking like a leaf, the dream playing on repeat through my head as I trembled. Not even being near my mom made me feel safe at that point. I remember being like that for hours afterward. The exhaustion finally caught up to me, and I fell asleep once again. My mother says that when she looked at me the next morning, she noticed that I had slept through the remainder of the night with my eyes open. I woke up a couple of hours later in a haze. My entire body felt heavy and weak. I made my way downstairs to where my mom and sister were. They asked me what I dreamt about. It all flooded into my head again, and I started crying hysterically. It would be several years later when I finally told them what the dream had been about. My mother called my school and let me stay home that day. She asked if I was hungry, but food was the last thing on my mind. She led me to my room and said I should have a nap since it's daytime and things will be more peaceful. I laid in my bed under the covers and wept. A chill ran through my spine and I stopped crying. Listening carefully, I could hear the whisper of a child. "Shh, don't worry, it'll be okay." I laid there frozen. I slowly pulled the blanket from over my eyes, only to witness my closet door slowly closing itself. I stared at it quietly for some time before hopping out of bed and running down to the living room. I didn't tell my mom about the closet or the whisper. I knew she would just blame them on the dream I'd had. So I kept that one a secret for a couple of years. My mother believes me now, though, now that I've told her everything while we were sharing our experiences. Weeks later, my Aunt Dana stayed with us for a week. It was a weekend where we were going to my dad's house. My mom and aunt were alone in the house while Derek was at work. My mom was watching General Hospital, and my aunt was using the shower. My aunt came running down the stairs out of nowhere, pale as a ghost. She asked my mom if she had walked into the bathroom a moment ago. My mom said no, of course not. My aunt described looking through the foggy shower door and seeing a woman with blonde hair in the bathroom staring at the mirror. My mother has brown hair. She then turned and walked out without making a sound or speaking a word. My aunt stared back up at the bathroom and said, "There's something very wrong with this house." She's not the only one who's ever said those words. I got my friend Brian to stay the night at my house with the promise of late-night gaming. He remembers the incident from before and asked how it was living in a haunted house. I said it's not all that bad, jokingly, of course. I didn't tell Brian about any of my personal stories in fear that he might end our friendship over it. The night hit about 11 p.m., and we switched from games to cartoons. We both fell asleep with the glow of my tiny TV upon us. Everything was fine until I was shaken awake by Brian. He was hysterical. He grabbed me and pulled me close and said, "I hear them. They giggle at me when I'm sleeping. There's something wrong with this house. I want to go home. Please let me go home." His scream woke up my mom, and she ran down the stairs to find Brian hyperventilating. She grabbed all of his belongings and walked him out of the house after he calmed down and down the street to his own house. She came back and said that Brian's dad didn't want his son to come over anymore just to get scared to death. I don't really blame him. He still came over sometimes, but he never stayed the night again, and he especially avoided the basement from that time on. There were a couple more parts to this story, but they played out in similar fashion to most of the other activity. My mom's relationship with Derek came to an end, and we were packing up stuff to move to a different city. After all of our belongings were removed, we walked slowly through parts of the house, talking about our stories of creepy happenings. My sister and I, feeling a bit brave due to us leaving and never coming back, had a surge of courage to ask the kids if they liked playing with us. It was dead silent in the house. My sister and I giggled to each other and said they probably hated playing with us because we were annoying. My mom says she felt something a bit different, almost like there were a couple of people who were sad to see us go. Derek also felt the same vibe. But after 2 years in the house in West Bountiful, we left. My mom and I still bring up the stories from time to time. We both get goosebumps from the blinding light story, and she's blown away by how terrible my dream was. I recently revisited that dream a month ago, not to my choosing, of course. Played out the exact same as that night when I was 8 years old, only this time I woke up calmly and shook it off. It was after that dream that I decided to write about what I can only describe as a ghost story. It may appear as fiction to many, but to us, it was a living reality. It saddens me that we didn't do more research into the house to see if there was ever a problem or a tragedy there. I don't live far from there currently, but there's a good chance that the house and many others were demolished in a housing project. Either way, I feel it's best left as it is. A creepy story. I'm 26 now, and I have a love of horror movies and creepy places. Maybe my exposure to these terrifying events flipped a couple of adrenaline switches in my head. I still don't have a definite answer as to whether ghosts really do exist, but I can't deny what we went through in the West Bountiful house. I was working out, and I was on the phone with my dad, and we were having a nice conversation. Then I heard this devilish scream. It literally sounded like some kind of demon or devil was screaming in my room. I heard it echo through my dad's line too, but he told me that he couldn't hear a thing. I was confused. I said, "What do you mean you didn't hear it?" And he said, "I just didn't hear it." My stomach dropped, so I took out the butcher knife and started walking to my room. I know, stupid idea. I probably should have just ran out of the house until somebody came back, but I did what I could. And keep in mind, I was home alone, and nobody could have saved me if something had come and popped up on me. I searched the room, and there was absolutely nothing. I searched the other rooms as well. Still nothing. I'm totally confused as to what happened. If anybody does know, please tell me, because as of right now, I'm never entering that room again until I know what that was. This is the story of Madeline, the doll that has my face. For context, my mom is the original owner of Madeline, but Madeline has been mine since I was a child. Madeline was bought by my mother about 35 years ago, long before I was born. There's a possibility that she's a lot older than that, as she was second-hand when my mom bought her. These are my experiences with this doll. I'm well aware that creepy doll is a trope, but stay with me. Madeline, I named her, is a porcelain doll with a soft body filled of horsehair, with her hands and feet and face made of plain white porcelain. Her hair, according to a doll expert I had her repaired by a few years ago, is a combination of horse and human. She's about 30 centimeters long, with brown hair, blue eyes, wears a blue cotton dress with embellishments, black leather lace-up boots, and a somewhat Victorian underdress. I believe she was pretty common, a generic doll type. I base this off the fact that I took her to doll shows as a child to find out a little bit more about her, since she doesn't have any marks, and another lady had her almost exact identical replica. Same dress, same colors, hair, and everything, so she must have been pretty common. The only difference? The face. The lady and I compared the dolls, vividly pointing out how my doll's face was almost identical to mine. I'm not saying it's impossible to have dolls who look somewhat similar to you. I mean, that's just good marketing, really. But at the time, I had a jaw problem that required surgery, and the doll's jaw perfectly matched mine. Heavy overbite. This lady's doll didn't at all. Given the dolls had everything else exactly the same except the face, it just sort of makes me wonder if at some point her face had been replaced or repainted before my mom purchased her. I don't believe Madeline to be a harmful entity, but a few strange things have happened that make me wonder. As a child, I kept her on my bed on the top bunk. I had one of those loft beds with a desk under it while I was at school. If someone was to change the sheets, they'd put her back, because Mom was always worried that the dog would eat her. She was always on my bed, and I was the only kid in the house, so I'm the only one who played with her at the time. At school one day, I would have been about 10 years old. I broke my right wrist. Most children will break something in childhood, and I had fallen out of a tree. I remember getting home from the hospital at about 8 p.m., and I was a bit dopey from the assistance they'd given me. Because I couldn't climb the bunk in a cast, Mom made me up the mattress on the ground. I had grabbed Madeline so that Mom could move the bed, when suddenly, Madeline's right hand dropped onto the carpet. I would brush this off, but more has happened. Once I needed stitches in my head. I came home and there was a chunk of Madeline's hair gone. I had jaw correction surgery. Now neither of us have an overbite. I've had knee surgery and have a scar on my right foot, and she has just had a crack repaired on her right foot. Mom, who hadn't seen her in a few years as I've had things in storage, recently made a comment, and it's what made me decide to tell my story. She said, "I remember her having a much younger looking face when you were little." Could this doll be aging with me, experiencing things like I am? I really don't know what it means, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts. I'm a carer, and I have been for about 5 or 6 years. I prefer to work nights, as it's a calmer working experience. I've seen and heard many strange things, but 2 stick out, and I thought I'd tell you about it. The first one. I was on shift one night, and every hour we have to do checks on the residents to make sure that they're okay and still with us. So I'm doing my checks, and everything is going okay, until I get to the last room. This lady likes her door closed at night, so the light in the corridor doesn't wake her up. And I go to open her door, but I couldn't move it. It was as if someone was pushing it shut from the other side. I tried 2 or 3 times to open it, and it just won't budge. Fearing that the lady has fallen behind it, I go to get the nurse on shift and my colleagues. Each of us try to open the door, but it won't move. After 20 minutes or so, the door opens easily, as it should do, and the lady was asleep in bed, snoring away, and there's nothing there to have kept the door closed. I should mention that this was in a part of the building that no one likes to be alone in, as it always feels like you're being watched. On a couple of occasions, a shadow has been seen in some of the rooms. The second, I came in on shift and found out that one of the residents had passed away just 30 minutes before the night staff got there. We were waiting for the undertakers to come and collect the body. It could be up to 2 hours before they got there. As we were going about our job, the buzzer went off in that room. I went and switched it off and left the room. His buzzer went off every 10 minutes until the undertakers arrived, and none of us could ever explain why or how it was doing that. This story happens in the Latin American country I was living in at the time. I was a 22 to 23-year-old female finishing my master's degree in the local university. I had a part-time job as a receptionist in an institute, and usually I had the afternoon shift. I left work every day at about 8:30 p.m. to go to the bus stop, then walk like 5 minutes to get home from there. Even though this is and was one of the most dangerous countries in the world, I lived in a relatively safe city in a good neighborhood. Still, I walked very alert of my surroundings, and I was ready to run and call for someone if needed. This is where my story starts. For a few days, I had been seeing this very big, expensive white SUV with tinted windows driving around my neighborhood. I'd never seen it before, but I just thought it was a new neighbor. After a few days, I started noticing that the SUV seemed to follow me. It was always parked in a corner of my street, and usually started driving when I walked past it. Obviously, this gave me the creeps, so I told my boyfriend and my parents. Since the driver never did anything, just drove, not even slowly at times, they said it could be a coincidence, and it could be, in fact, a neighbor. What started as nighttime encounters that went on for several weeks, but not on a regular basis, turned into daytime encounters. This SUV started to follow me around the neighborhood, sometimes passing by me fast several times in a row, sometimes slow, almost at the same speed I was walking. I discreetly took note of the license plate and always kept it in my phone, as it was a popular year model SUV. I started to look for it everywhere I went, and I noticed that they followed me to other parts of the city. This really freaked me out, and I finally contacted the police. I didn't do it before because they're mostly useless. They, of course, told me that they couldn't do anything about it unless it was physical. Otherwise, they could assume that it was just a coincidence. I was in panic mode. I even dreamed about this situation. I alerted my parents, my boyfriend who was working in another city, friends and coworkers. I even told my boss, and surprisingly, she let me go in and out of work at different schedules so as to try to avoid the driver. This seemed to work for the first week, and I thought it was over. Silly me. It wasn't. One morning, I was going to the bakery to buy some fresh bread for lunch, and there was the SUV. They started to slowly follow me. I was very anxious. I still shake just thinking about it. The only thing I was thinking was that I needed to run, but I didn't want to alert them that I knew they were following me. For context, my street was very long, and on one side there were only buildings. On the other side there was a tall wall. No houses, no people passing. My goal was to arrive to the little shopping center where the bakery was. But when I saw they were still following me, I knew that that wasn't a good option. They could get me on my way out. For the first time, it got confrontational. They rolled down one window and started to scream things at me. So I decided to go to my friend's office, which was on the second story of the shopping center. I quickly ran up the stairs and went into her office. I told her how they were following me, and that this time I had an even worse feeling about it. She got scared also and told me to go hide in the bathroom and lock the door. A few minutes later, guess what? A chubby, balding man in his 40s walked in and casually asks her about me. He said he was driving down the street when he saw his cousin entering her office. Since it had been a while since he had last seen her, me, he wanted to say hi, but she didn't hear him calling her, so he parked his car and went up to greet her. He insisted that he had seen this cousin walking inside the office, but my friend, bless her, insisted with a poker face that no one had ever entered her workplace since a few hours ago. She said later that she was shaking inside, but she wasn't going to let them get the better of her. He asked if she was sure, and she kept telling the same story over and over and insisting that there was no one there and that she was all alone. She asked him to go. All the while, I was listening to this exchange from the bathroom. When he finally left, she closed her office and told me it was safe to go out. I cried. I was petrified with fear and terror, and so was she. We immediately called the police. This time they took me more seriously, and as I had the license plate number, they agreed to patrol the neighborhood on a regular basis. My friend called her boyfriend, who was a taxi driver from the company downstairs, and he took me home because my legs were shaking and I couldn't even move. From that day on, I always had someone driving me in and out of work or school, or I took taxis, something that I hadn't done before because they're expensive. I think the police presence in the area spooked him, or maybe the police found him and had a talk with him. I never knew. I never want to know either. I shiver thinking about what his intentions with me were, but the fear comes back every time I think about him. My parents still live in the area, as does my friend, but I eventually moved out of the city. I received a call from my brother with no caller ID or phone company record very soon after he died. It sounded like long-distance calls used to sound back when we all had landlines, as if he was very distant. At first I was perplexed, but once I said his name, things cleared up a bit, and soon after the call ended. I think his energy was just still strong enough that he had the ability to pop in to let me know he was okay. He's visited many times in other ways. The most concrete was a lucid dream in which he revealed that he was not relieved that his long battle with cancer was over. I have a good vocabulary, but he used terminology that I just would not have. It wouldn't have even been in my mind. So I know it wasn't my own mind trying to work through his death. He was more tethered in the time soon after his death. Now he just pays visits now and then, especially when I'm sick. I know it because sometimes I feel his hand on my forehead, something he always liked me to do for him when he was ill. My kids and I have had a lot of experiences, not just with him. But I'll always remember that phone call right after he died. My husband and I met a guy who used to work in our house. In conversation one day, he said, "So have you met the ghosts yet?" My husband started laughing and said, "We sure have." We were a little bit skeptical as to whether we'd imagined the things that happened, but laborers working here have been very unsettled by some events, and in some cases, they've refused to come back. We've always lived in houses where strange things happen, but this one has really been a wild ride. It's very haunted. Noises, floorboards creaking with footsteps, bangs, doors opening, lights and sockets switching on and off, things moving, voices, shadows, it's crazy. He also told us some of the things that happened here. It's a very old house, and in recent years it was a home for addicts with new babies. A lot of serious, horrific trauma happened here. I cried when he told us about it. It's unsurprising to me, therefore, that the energy here is so charged. Knowing this, I thought that over the weekend I might light some candles and sage the house, and invite anything to leave that needs to go. Though I suppose some will probably want to stay. I'd be interested to know what you would do here. Our family and friends have said to move out, but we like it here. We don't have any bad experiences, really. We're not frightened. And as far as advice goes, I don't really want any advice on exorcisms or fleeing the house. The worst thing we've ever experienced was a disembodied groaning noise. It was very human and very strange, but if it was intended to frighten us, it didn't. I raised my eyebrows at my husband and then carried on working. Last night, my husband and I opened doors and windows all throughout the house. We started in the cellar and worked our way up through the house. There are 28 rooms or spaces, so it took us ages. I used white sage sticks, tea light candles, and a bowl each to carry the candles in, which were gifts from loved ones and sentimental to us. As we moved through the house, I just talked, asking any spirits who didn't respect us or wanted to harm us to leave our house, that this was our home and we wouldn't tolerate it, and that if anybody wished to stay, they could, but they had to respect us and treat us with kindness, and we would do the same. In the rooms where we felt the most oppressive energy, one bedroom in particular, I spent a while talking out loud to any spirits trapped here because of the traumatic house history. I said that they were free to move on now and to go and find their loved ones. Who knows if it did anything, but I felt like we had to try, so I did it with belief and conviction. My husband had a strange interaction in the cellar where the sage was knocked from his hand, but he remained firm and told them that they had to leave and they weren't allowed to touch him. Our cat was avidly watching the house spirit cat as usual and following it around. And then he seemed to be watching and following things with his eyes through the kitchen to the back door. We were just watching, fascinated. I said thank you just in case they were leaving, so we'll see if things get better. We'll see if they seem more peaceful. I certainly slept very well last night, so fingers crossed. Through my younger years, from about 7 to 12, my mother dated a guy very on and off, which I think mostly had to do with him being in the army and staying with his family in Laredo, Texas whenever he was home. Either way, he invited us to visit his cousin's summer cabin in Monterey, Mexico for a weekend, so we did. The cabin was very ranch style, longer in one dimension and shorter in the other, so it was built like an architectural rectangle. On one far side of the building, think of this in an aerial view, was the kitchen, and next to it was the living room. Attached to the living room was a long, slender hallway, connected to bedrooms on each side, and a bathroom on one of the sides. The backyard was only accessible through the living room via a sliding door, and what started as a bit of the desert floor met by a forest's tree line, although there weren't a lot of trees. Mostly it was dead and dying Monterey cypress trees. Meeting the so-called tree line was an elevated hunting tower. Its platform met the top of the vertical tree line. On our way to the cabin, my mom's boyfriend was telling us about a cursed legend of the witches of Monterey. Apparently, they had been haunting the mountainous area for generations, and were his childhood version of La Llorona. Clearly, he was trying to scare us from the get-go, and me being so young, I was eating it up like candy. We got to the cabin in the late evening, so we decided to stay in for the night and watch M. Night Shyamalan's The Lady in the Water. After the movie, my mom's boyfriend asked me to go get something from the bedroom for him, and as I was halfway down the hallway, he turned the lights off on me. Let me remind you that this was a very rural part of Mexico, so the dark was dark. So with all the scary stories and the, at the time for me, scary movie, I was spooked and I froze. my mom's boyfriend began to make your stereotypical ghost noises and taunted me to go deeper into the dark hallway. But I was so petrified, I remember just standing there, frozen in fear. Long story short, my mother got onto him and he turned the lights back on. They comforted me, and after a few apologies, we all went to bed. I can't remember how I slept that night, but I honestly wish I did. The next day, we did basic tourist things. Went to a bazaar, embraced the city's beautiful mountain range, which seemed to hug the city, ate authentic Mexican food, and visited the main hub of the city. When the day was all done, we decided to call it and went back to the cabin. What's strange is that I remember the night before so vividly, but I can't remember much about this night other than what I'm about to share with you. I was in the living room of the cabin, and I remember my mom's boyfriend was there with me. He asked if I wanted to go up into the hunting tower out back with him, and I said yes. I remember following him through the back door of the living room, and I remember him walking ahead and turning back to wave me toward him. I thought he was just trying to help me keep up with him, so I followed him. I watched him climb up the ladder of the hunting tower, and then I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, where are you going?" I turned around. It was my mom's boyfriend behind me, asking where I was going. I didn't know how to say, "I was following you." I turned back around to look at the hunting tower along the tree line, and nobody was there. Nothing was. Not an animal, not my mother, not a ghost, nothing. Fast forward to a few years ago, my now wife and I were still dating at the time, and sharing ghost experiences with one another. I told her about this experience and Monterey, and I'll never forget the look on her face when I told her. She is from a Mexican family as well, and this legend of the witches of Monterey is a very real thing for her as well. The scary part? I was telling her this story on a Friday, and according to what her family told her growing up, Friday is a forbidden day to talk about them because that's one day of the week that they're most powerful. Apparently, they never forget their prey, and they use that day as a lure toward what was lost. Initially, I thought, that's BS. But I can't begin to express how many Fridays my wife had to stop me because I would randomly bring up the story. Maybe it was just self-conscious, I don't know. But it still kind of freaks me out to this day. This happened when I was around 9 or 10. I was staying the night at my friend Catherine's for the first time. We met the summer before, and we'd been inseparable ever since. Kat lived in this old 2-story house, surrounded by woods and dirt road. The house itself gave me an uneasy feeling when I first saw it. The shutters were falling off. The paint on the house seemed to be fading. It was an old piece of crap now that I think about it, but at the time, I was excited. I remember walking in after staring at the house for what seemed like 20 minutes. Surprisingly, the inside was a lot nicer than the outside. So I pushed that uneasy feeling down and just shrugged it off as nerves. I remember the smell of the house. I can't pinpoint it, but it was different, like walking into a musty room. I started to walk around, just to explore my surroundings, but I noticed Kat's mom watching me. I simply smiled and waved, but she just stood there, staring at me, wide-eyed. I had never met her before, but why was she staring at me like that? Suddenly, Kat flew around the corner and tackled me. We both fell and started to giggle. I noticed Kat's mom out of the corner of my eye start to turn around and walk off, and she was gone. Fast forward a couple of hours, Kat and I are laying on a beanbag in her room watching Children of the Corn, which, by the way, was one of my favorite movies at the time. I grew up watching horror movies, mostly Stephen King or any movie that my mom was watching at the time. Not her decision, but mine, because I love the feeling that a good horror movie gives you. She felt the same way, and that's why we clicked so much. Anyway, we were sitting here watching this movie, and suddenly the door opposite us slams closed. We both jumped and giggled and brushed it off because, well, we were kids. Until the second time, when it creaked open and slammed again, not seconds after the first time. Now I'm sitting there staring at this door, trying to figure out how in the world it's opening and closing by itself. In the midst of all that, the only other person in this house is Kat's mom, which I figured out earlier in the day was also just a tad creepy. "Do you think it's just your mom?" I asked, but she just shook her head. "Are you sure?" I asked again, but this time she said something that gave me the chills, and still does. She said, "My mom isn't home, it's just me and you, silly." I just stared at her, trying to wrap my head around what she had just said. Who leaves their 9-year-old home alone with a friend in a 2-story house? "Where's your mom?" I asked her. "She's at work." I giggled, thinking that she was just trying to trick me. "No, she's at work. She only works for a couple of hours, so she leaves me here because she trusts me." At this point, I'm just looking at her, and she noticed this look of worry on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. I said, "If your mom is at work, then who was that lady staring at me earlier?" As I said this, we heard what seemed like footsteps at the time, but thinking about it now, it sounded more like shuffling in one spot, above us. I'm completely scared at this point. Every hair on my neck is standing on end, and I just want to leave. I start to get up when Kat pulled me back down and asked me if I heard that noise. I nodded. It was silent again, until the footsteps were back, but louder and faster. We both stared up at the ceiling, and she grabbed my hand. "This happens every day," she whispered. I looked over at her, and I could see true fear on her face. The footsteps stopped, and she looked at me, her face flushed white. "Is there an attic?" I asked. She pointed up toward the ceiling. "Well, maybe it's just squirrels or birds," I kept thinking over and over. You ever notice when you're really quiet, that's when you can hear almost everything around you? Imagine if you're sitting in a house with your best friend alone at 10 years old, and you hear the giggle of a 3-year-old child. Mind you, she has no siblings. We were completely alone. Kat was just as scared as I was. I remember thinking that I just wanted to get out of this house. I grabbed her and ran out the door. At least we would feel safer and less scared outside the house than we would in it. "Want to hear a story?" Kat asked, pulling my mind back into reality. I nodded. "Well, this house used to be a daycare. There was this lady that would watch the kids, and one day she just locked them all in the attic, and then she hung herself from a rope in the kitchen. They all died because the kids were hungry and thirsty, and no one found them for months afterwards, in this house." My heart started to pound, my eyes wide with fear, and I just looked at her. "It's true," she said. "I've seen them, the little kids, every day, but I've never seen the lady. But you have, earlier." After she told me this, I don't remember much else except running out the door of her room and making it outside. Kat followed, begging me to stay, but I just had to get out. My stomach felt like knots. I felt as though I had walked into a horror movie, and I just wished the day had never happened. Fast forward years later, that was the last day I had ever seen or heard from Kat. I remember her always coming to play outside at my dad's during the day. I remember what she looked like. I never remembered meeting her parents or seeing them out in public. I'm now 27, and I can't seem to find any proof that she exists. All my friends that I was friends with then, I'm still friends with now, even after all these years. But why not her? I think her scary story might have had some flaws, but I still wonder what happened in that house. I've driven by there maybe 15 times, and I still wonder if maybe she was one of the ones that never made it out. Some friends and I recently visited an abandoned nursing home. We found all kinds of old, cool stuff, and it was really interesting walking around in there. We took a spirit box with us to see if we could get any interaction with ghosts. We were standing in a dark, empty room, put all our lights out, and turned on the spirit box. We made contact with multiple people. We asked them questions, and they responded. I had never talked to ghosts before, so this was really special for me. There were a lot of voices. We kept talking to them until we heard a very loud bang from upstairs. We were startled, and our first reaction was to turn everything off and stay silent for a while. After some time, it was still quiet, so we moved on exploring the rest of the building, until later, again we heard a very loud bang from upstairs. Again, we kept quiet and waited, but at this point it began to get really scary. We went upstairs, and we saw this big blood splatter against the wall. At that point, we knew that maybe it was time to go, so we were slowly heading back. We got right in front of a big closed door that we wanted to exit through when we heard a loud noise from the other side of it. We ran as fast as we could to the nearest exit. We actually had to crawl through a hole in the wall to exit the building. As we were outside, we looked up to the floor where we had heard the noise coming from, and we saw something that looked like a shadow standing in the opening of a hole in the wall. It was hard to see since it was dark outside. Still, to this day, I'm very curious about what was behind that door. But maybe it's better that we never found out. This happened a few months ago, and it's really been bugging me. I was out hiking and rappelling with a friend in the hills area near Tombstone. I want to mention that I have spent quite a bit of time solo hiking and camping. I'm used to hearing noises and brushing it off. Anyway, it's late afternoon, and I'm the first one to rappel down. I got to the bottom, and while my partner was getting ready to follow, we heard this noise that I would describe most like a growl or a snarl. It sounded like it was coming from the ridge above both of us. If facing the cliff, it sounded like it was coming from the right side. We both looked around, but didn't see anything. I encouraged him to come down, and I even half joked that it was probably just a bear or a mountain lion. At that point, I wasn't even feeling that nervous. I figured that once the two of us were together again, we would be pretty intimidating to an animal. While he rappelled down, I heard a loud crash to what seemed to be parallel to me on my left. By this point, I'm starting to get pretty scared, because this sound was getting closer and closer. Somehow, it had gone from right to left, on an exposed cliff face without either of us seeing it. He successfully rappelled down, and we both agreed we needed to get out of there. We still had a steep downhill climb to the car. We packed up the gear as fast as we could. As we get our packs back on, we heard what sounded to me like a howler monkey. The noise was close, and we still couldn't see what was making it. Of course, it was from the direction that we needed to go. We hauled butt down that mountain and got in the car. I know that it can be pretty easy to let the mind play tricks, but we have the exact same account of what happened. Both of us are really familiar with what's out there, and we've never heard anything like it. Now, this is the part that I hesitate to tell, because I know it sounds even more insane. But we both heard whispering and giggling, like it was right next to us, but we still couldn't see anything. I keep trying to explain to myself that our minds just played a trick. The same trick, but a trick. The first noise I would chalk up to maybe a bear or a mountain lion. Animals are stealthy. They could run in front of us without us noticing, I guess. Something else could have fallen to the right side. What made that monkey noise, though? I don't know. And why do we both say we heard whispering? I don't know. I don't know if anybody else has creepy experiences in Arizona. I want to believe somebody was just pranking us, but there wasn't a single other car in the parking area. My friend believes that we experienced something supernatural. I honestly have no idea what to think. When I was a kid, I would come home from school almost every single day to the attic door being unlocked. I would ask my mom about it, and she would just look at me like I was crazy. The house had full-sized attic doors on the second floor. I would lock the one in the bathroom every single day when I got home. Eventually, after my mom said that she wasn't doing it, I just stopped worrying about it because it freaked me out so much. But I also used to hear what sounded like footsteps in the overhead attic when I would try to go to sleep. I ignored this as well for the same reasons. I was the only one who lived on the second floor from grades 3 to 12. I started noticing it at about grade 7. And at about grade 10, I stopped checking on it. We never did find an explanation for who or what was constantly unlocking that attic door. So I've never been one to say that I believe in ghosts, but there's something here. My boyfriend and I bought a house last year, an old home, almost 100 years old, with a half-finished attic. The attic has this energy. I love it. It draws me in, and also our cat. Our cat would live in this 100-degree attic if we let him. The dog is terrified. Won't even go up there if I'm carrying him, and he'll freak out and run away if I try. My boyfriend is also scared of it. He says he hears a lot of noises, footsteps. The door up there slams shut and opens with all the windows being closed. He said he'll wake up in the middle of the night terrified of what he hears up there. I could sit up there for hours. The energy just feels, I guess, strong and powerful, but I don't really feel in danger. I feel comfortable, but he feels terrified. The cat loves it, the dog hates it. I'm not really into this stuff because I've never really believed in it before, but I'm trying to understand what's happening here. How could the same thing provoke two different results? It's so interesting. My parents own a sprawling 3-story manor built in 1912. This house has a finished bedroom in the attic, which is mildly weird on its own. But when I turned 14 and was going into high school, I begged them to empty the junk out and let me live there. I thought it would be totally awesome, like having an apartment away from the rest of my family. They agreed I could do it, and I got to paint it, and put in new carpet and fill it with the furniture that I picked out. All vintage, because that's what I like. The place was awesome, but the door didn't quite fit into the jamb anymore, so it would swing open on its own. I was not cool with having the door open to the rest of the attic in the middle of the night. I shut the door as tightly as it would go, and before bed, I jammed it shut with my desk chair. I really wedged it in there. I had my sister test, and the door would not budge from the attic side. Cool. I went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed, until I noticed that the desk chair was tucked back under the desk. The door was shoved all the way open, so hard that it had actually dented the wall, and I had no explanation. To this day, all present family members swear they didn't do it, and I think I would have had to have heard them anyhow. I decided the ghosts in the attic didn't like me shutting them out. For the duration of my time living in the attic, several years, I left the door open, and nothing else really happened, so I guess all they wanted was some freedom. Still, definitely freaked me out. This story happened about 4 years ago. I'm in my late 20s, and so is my friend. It was around June, in Toowoomba, Australia. My friend, let's call him Mark, asked me to come pick him up from his college, Downlands. June is when it gets coldest in Toowoomba, and that night I remember it reaching -4 degrees Celsius, or about 25 degrees Fahrenheit. It was around 6:30 when I reached the college. Mark is a teacher there, and apparently his car had stopped working. I wandered through the dark trying to find the admin block. I finally reached the block, and Mark was inside. He looked shaken up. I asked him what had happened. He said in a shaky voice, "He's here. A ghost. We're at the school too late. He's been moving stuff." Now, as you can imagine at this point, I started to absolutely freak out. Dowlands is a boarding school, so I knew there was a small amount of people still there. However, the boarding block and admin block are far, far apart, and I was not about to wander through the dark pathways with Mark spouting the stuff that he was. Instead, I decided to go back to the car with him. So we locked up the office and cautiously walked out. We were blindly walking the concrete path in our thick jumpers. The wind was making an eerie howling noise as it started to blow gusts. Then I saw a flickering light, an orange light, coming from behind us. All of a sudden it got really warm, and I mean a quick, sudden boost in temperature kind of warm. We were about halfway down this hill, so Mark and I turned around to see what was at the top of the hill. This still freaks me out when I think about it. It was a man on fire. He was standing there watching us. When we turned around, he stared at us for about 5 seconds, although it felt more like 5 hours. He then let out the most horrendous scream and started to run at us. Mark and I ran and fell over the side of the path. The man on fire ran past us, down the hill and into the forest. I got up and I looked down toward the oval. He was still running. He just came out of the forest and was running toward the road until both he and the fire vanished. At that point, we decided to run to the boarding block to find another member of the faculty. We reached the block and we found one of Mark's colleagues. He let us stay the night. We were told that it was a really common thing to see if you stayed in the admin block too late, or if you were walking those paths at that time of night. Even from this block, everyone can hear his screams, at least once a week, they say. Apparently he terrorizes the school grounds at dark. The faculty member, who was also a teacher, said that he had only seen the Burning Man once. When I asked Mark the next morning what he had seen in the admin block, he said, "All the drawers started to open, and I heard a voice say, 'The fire has been lit.' When I first started to work here, the office ladies warned me that I shouldn't stay late near the building. Now I know why," he concluded. Before we left the next morning, we went to the admin block and asked the office ladies if they had ever seen him. We went in and saw a younger lady in her 30s. She asked, "Do you have an appointment, Mark?" "No," he said. "We just wanted to ask if you've ever seen..." Then an older lady, maybe in her late 60s or early 70s, came out from the back and said, "You two saw the Burning Man, didn't you?" Mark replied, "Yes, we did. We saw him last night." The old woman came closer and said, "Yes, all the drawers were open. I've seen him many a time. Not a pleasant experience. Try not to stay late, and if you do, don't come anywhere near this building." The younger lady spoke up. "I've seen him twice. I hated it. I've never stayed late again." We both left, and Mark got the day off. I never stepped foot on those school grounds ever again. So 30 years ago, I'm about 13 to 14. An older friend and I are babysitting for a 6-year-old girl and her younger brother. We had been told that sometimes the girl complains about seeing a ghost man in her bedroom and upstairs at night, and that he comes out through the attic door. Now, I didn't believe a word of it. Kids are weird and they say weird things. We get the kids ready for bed, but they would not settle. The girl said that she felt scared, and her little brother started crying. She asked if she could sleep in her mom's bed until she got home, and the little brother wanted to go with her. So I tucked them in and I told them some silly stories and I laughed until they were both tired. Both kids were virtually asleep when we left, door ajar, hall light on. An hour later, we're sitting downstairs watching The Equalizer and all was good. The kids were definitely asleep, as I had to sneak past their room to use the bathroom. I even had a quick peek on my way back. The little brother got a bit of a mini shoot snore going on, but everything else was quiet. Back downstairs, we watched TV a bit more. About 20 minutes go by, and out of nowhere, we hear banging. Heavy, heavy banging. The kids start screaming immediately. I run up the stairs and meet the kids as they're running out of the room. Now before, I thought it was the kids, but this time I have my eyes on the kids, so I know that they're not making the sound. And we hear it again. Bang, bang. The kids fly at me. I grab the little brother and we rush down the stairs into the front room, shut all the doors, and all crash onto the sofa. Everything is silent, apart from the TV, which I turn off. We sat in silence for about 5 minutes, just kind of holding each other. After a few minutes, the little girl, with tears in her eyes, just says in a very matter-of-fact way, "The man was angry because I wasn't in my room, so he tried to push over the wardrobe and then started thumping the wall." This event has stayed with me all these years. A couple of years ago, I babysat for a family friend. She and her husband lived with their 2 kids, a girl about 7 who we'll call Kay, and a boy about 12 who we can call Jay. I babysat these kids so much that we became very close, brother and sister type deal. They weren't difficult kids. They had a hard home life because their parents were borderline abusive, but they were still good kids. I tried my best to be a positive adult. I was only 18 or 19 during this experience. The family moved around a lot. I've known them now for over 6 years, and they have moved every single year. This experience happened in 2015. I was halfway through my senior year when the family moved into this house. It was really nice. It had just been built in 2013 or something like that. It was a nice neighborhood, but rent was really low. The mother often bragged about the steal of a deal she got for the house. To put it in perspective, the average rent in this area is about $1,200 a month just for an apartment. These guys got a whole 2-story house, 3 beds, 4 baths, freshly built in a nice neighborhood for $650 a month. I thought it was weird and asked if there was anything wrong with the home, to which she replied that the inspection had come back clear. I didn't think much about it beyond that. I started babysitting, and I immediately felt something was off. I have anxiety, so going to new places really puts me in a funk, so I just figured that's what it was, at first. The way the home is set up is important. On the bottom floor, they had a living room, a dining area, and a kitchen with some other rooms. I spent most of my time in the living room, working on things for school while the kids were upstairs playing games or hanging out with friends. While you're in the living room, there's a wall that blocks you from seeing the stairs. Upstairs, there are bedrooms. Immediately off the stairs and above the living room is the parents' room, which was off limits to the kids. Then there was a loft area that looked down over the front door to make a grand foyer feeling. There's a light that can be on which can be seen from downstairs because of the loft. Then the kids' bedrooms were down the hall. So nothing really happened at first that was too mind-boggling. Little noises here and there, knocks on the walls, things being misplaced, lights flickering, but nothing that made me think ghosts. I figured they got what they paid for, and my memory was garbage. After a couple of months, things started to pick up, and I could no longer blame it on a bad memory or a faulty electrical system. The kids, who were usually very sweet and kind to each other, started becoming noticeably more snappy to everyone, especially Jay. He complained about having nightmares, about somebody standing in his doorway watching him. His parents wouldn't listen, though. Their behavior grew even worse as time went on. It was a weekend, and the parents were going to be gone for a while. The kids were upstairs just doing their thing. I was downstairs in the living room, looking at pizza to order for lunch. Out of nowhere, I hear really loud footsteps coming from above me in the parents' bedroom, thunderous even. Thinking that it was the kids being little dingus meats, I immediately headed upstairs to tell them to get out. But I was greeted with the two kids standing in their doorways, staring at the closed door to their parents' room. The footsteps and bangs were still going on inside. At this point, I thought it was an intruder. I instructed the kids to get into their rooms and lock their doors, and I called emergency and explained the situation. As I stayed on the phone, the footsteps continued to walk around the room. I could hear them moving in different locations. 2 officers arrived, so I grabbed the kids and we waited outside. The banging still went on as one of the officers escorted us out. They came out empty-handed and said that there was nothing there, and that there may have been something with the door because the banging stopped as soon as they opened it. I had felt the shaking of the floor moving around the room, so I knew that it wasn't a door, but I guess in my denial I ignored it. I took the kids out for ice cream and tried not to think about it. Another time, the kids and I were sitting in the dining area eating dinner. It was just us 3 in the house. From the dining area, you could see the light upstairs was on, and it cast a shadow onto the floor. I was making a joke about how I'm the only one who knows how to turn a light off around here. And that's when I saw a shadow of a hand from upstairs on the front door. And I think that's when it really started settling down with me, that the house was haunted. The kids didn't see it, and I didn't tell them. I figured it would just add stress that they really didn't need. I told the parents that night when they came home, but they brushed me off, saying they've never experienced anything at all. This continued on for a while. I would experience something, the kids would, but the parents wouldn't believe any of us. It was summer, just after I graduated high school. I remember it vividly because I was awake, reading articles about a huge thing that happened in my town. That's when the banging from upstairs started happening. I was used to it at this point, but what I was not used to was the banging footsteps coming down the stairs. These steps were methodical and menacing. I felt terrible energy in the room, and it was cold, despite it being in the middle of summer in the south. I counted the seconds between steps, and it was 5, every single time. I called out to the kids and told them to stop joking around, but I knew it wasn't them. I was terrified. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs, and I couldn't see who was there. Then I saw an apparition of a little girl. She had brunette hair and a red dress. She looked innocent enough, but the energy in the room was so heavy I almost threw up. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and she didn't move. I thought I was hallucinating, so I started to rub my eyes. But when I finished rubbing them, she was still there, right in front of me. No longer at the foot of the stairs. I never heard her move. In that situation, I couldn't move or do anything. My mind just went to kid brain, and I hid under the blanket I was using. I called the parents crying and told them to come back immediately. When they came, the energy in the room lightened, and I finally came out from under the blanket. She was gone. They asked what was wrong and what happened, and I told them, but of course it didn't matter, because they wouldn't believe me. I then informed them that they needed to find another babysitter, because I would not be returning. I still wonder about the kids. I hope they ended up okay. They moved out of that house at the end of the year, but I'm not sure if what I saw was attached to them or not. I'm still not sure what I saw. Anyway, I still have nightmares about the girl, and it's still a really frightening event for me. This story was posted to Reddit by user Werner Verklempt, who tells about a theater with a ghostly reputation. Here's the tale. About 30 years ago, I spent several years working in movie theaters in Worcester, Massachusetts. My favorite was the huge old building that had been chopped up into 4 separate cinemas. It had been a beautiful theater back when it was built in 1926 as the Pole Palace. Though it had been semi-destroyed during modernization in the late 50s, there were still many original features of the building that remained. As a manager, I had been issued a big keychain that gave me access to the entirety of the building, and I spent countless hours exploring nearly every part of that building. Except the curtain loft, which would have required climbing an iron ladder up about 80 feet. No thank you. The building had attics and basements and crawl spaces. There was an area in the front of the building on the second floor that had 2 or 3 abandoned businesses that had been walled off. There was a music store and a ballet studio and maybe an office. There was also a bathroom. Everything looked like it was from the 1940s or 50s. Faded wallpaper with ballerina motif, a peeling mirror on the wall. In another section of the building was the old manager's office, with high ceilings and crown molding and a beautiful stained glass window that I believe dated back to 1912 and had previously been part of an adjacent theater. There was still an old safe in the office. I found a newspaper article in the public library from 1942 or 44 that detailed an armed robbery when 2 men had tied up the managers in the office and robbed the safe. One of those men was later executed in the electric chair for an unrelated crime. We used the old manager's office to store giant 30-gallon bags of popcorn. There was also a sort of crawl space under the box office that was accessible by lifting a hinged plywood panel and climbing over a 4-foot wall. On the other side were the remains of a couple of basement rooms with broken concrete and bricks strewn about. In one of those rooms, I found an old flared Coca-Cola glass in perfect condition. I kept it for years. I also found a deck of cards in a handmade leather pouch with a snap closure, fashioned out of a buffalo nickel. There were also old dressing rooms with makeup mirrors and light bulbs. The paint was peeling off the walls in potato chip-sized flakes. As you can surmise, the building was purported to be haunted. The head manager claimed to have had ghostly experiences, so I'll start there, I guess. When the building was remodeled in the late 1950s, the men's room in the basement was converted into the manager's office. One night, while closing up, the manager, my boss, made his way up to the stairs to the main lobby. As he emerged, something caught his eye. Way up by the ornate 30-foot ceiling, he saw an apparition floating there. It disappeared into the ceiling. Terrified, he ran back down the stairs and hid in the office until daylight. Another time, he was again working late. There were several arcade machines in an area of the lobby, and they were normally powered off when the last shows were in. As he climbed the stairs, he heard all of the machines making their electronic bleeps and bloops. He was annoyed that the usher had clearly failed to turn off the machines before punching out, and realized that he would have to go do it himself. As soon as he opened the door, though, the noises stopped dead. Looking across the lobby from where he emerged, the machines were all dark. They were indeed powered off. A projectionist claimed that he looked out of the booth window one night in the big theater upstairs while shutting things down and saw a face looking in at him. I take those stories with a grain of salt. I was always skeptical of those based on the sources, but here's my experience. I was obsessed with the history of the building and would research newspaper archives for articles about it. There were rumors that a stagehand had died there in an accident during the time that it had been a vaudeville theater. I was never able to confirm that. I had talked about the building to my mother, and she, in turn, happened to discuss it with a woman that she worked with. The woman claimed to be a psychic or clairvoyant, or maybe just that she would get feelings about things. She told my mother that she had been to that theater, and that she felt that somebody had indeed been killed there, and that his name began with the letter M. My reaction was, okay, sure, she sounds nutty. Sometime later, I was the sole manager on duty on a slow night midweek. I was alone in the office in the basement. The 7 o'clock shows were in, and I was doing paperwork. The intercom buzzed. It was the box office cashier calling to tell me that I had a phone call. I asked who it was, and she said that she didn't know. I hung up the intercom and pushed the button for the main incoming line where the call was holding. The earpiece erupted with loud, close squealing and static. I used the word close because it was so loud and distinct that I assumed that it was something wrong with the phone PBX in our building rather than the line itself or the caller's phone. It was just the impression I had. Hello? Nothing. Just more squealing and static. Hello? I repeated. Hello? A man's voice. Calm, flat, distinct. Then nothing further. Who is this? I was a bit perplexed. All of the noise on the line and the caller seemingly reluctant to speak. This is Mike. Calm, quiet, not shouting over the noise of the line like he couldn't even hear it. Quite audible and clear, then nothing but the awful squealing and static. I waited a few seconds for the caller to continue. After all, he called me. Presumably there was a reason. But nothing. Mike who? I said, feeling a little bit impatient. Mike is a common name, and there were 2 Mikes employed there at the time. One of them had a fairly high-pitched voice that sounded nothing like the caller. It didn't sound like the other Mike either. The line abruptly went dead. Silent. The squealing and hissing stopped. I waited. Nobody called back. I called Sandy, the box office cashier, and asked her if they had asked for me personally or just to speak to the manager. She said that the caller had asked for me by name. And suddenly, I remembered my mother's friend. A man's name beginning with the letter M. Mike. It never happened again, and the phone never made those noises again. No one ever confessed to some kind of a prank. And I never figured out who it was. Reddit user Between the Cold Wires posted a story about something they witnessed. Blink and you'll miss it. This is the story. My apartment overlooks a big freeway. Through my bathroom and kitchen windows, you can see everything on the freeway. I can't tell you how many times I have seen horrific wrecks that have shook my place. When I want to use the restroom, my toilet is right there by the window, so you always see what's going on. I came across 5 cop cars, 1 wrecker, fire trucks, and 2 cars. The first car was white, and then about 8 feet behind it was another car. The wrecker was in front of everything, and it hadn't even dropped the bed or anything. Normally I just glance over and feel kind of bad about what I'm seeing and move on. But this time it was different, because it looked like there were a bunch of rescue people on the car, in the back, and there was stuff being pulled out all over the ground. But the cars didn't look wrecked, and normally there aren't that many cop cars unless it's a crime. I can't see that well, because I need my glass to see the small details, and I was curious what they were doing in that car and what was on the ground. Was it a shooting or something? Another weird thing is that I didn't hear any wreck like I normally do. I didn't hear anything at all. I only noticed that all this commotion was happening when I looked out the window. So I thought, I'm gonna run out to my car and get my glasses, because I use them for driving. As I went down, I also passed my kitchen window, and I saw all the red lights flashing. Just a few seconds to go down the stairs, and a few more seconds to my car, got my glasses, came back up, and in a matter of 2 minutes, everything out that window was gone. There was no evidence of anything, not even debris on the ground. There's no way that one wrecker that didn't even have its bed down to move the 2 cars was gone that fast. There was no way that all of that stuff was pulled out of the car and somehow put back in completely in 2 minutes. What the heck just happened? The feeling you get when something like this happens to you is a split second of, did I just lose time? I know I'm not crazy. Did any of this even happen? About 20 years later, I had another experience living by the freeway. with some wrecks, but nothing like this. Still crazy though. What happened was I heard a wreck, called it in, and they came out. The person was deceased. I watched them clean it all up and then went to bed. 30 minutes later, I heard a wreck, jumped up, looked out my window, and it looked like the exact same wreck. I called that one in too, just in case. I even told them that there was a prior wreck, the exact same way on this location, and I started questioning 911, asking if they had properly cleaned up the area. As I watched the second wreck, it was pretty much identical. The person was deceased in the exact same way. In the morning, I checked out the news, and what happened was that both cars went the wrong way up the ramp at the same location, hours apart, and both were decapitated in the same spot. The ramp appears to have no problems or indications that would have directed people onto it instead of off. I knew then that something really weird had happened that was unexplainable. What's even more messed up? I just checked our city's active incident reports, and it's not on there. I would say to look between 11 and 12 p.m., so I did. I looked at the time and date, and it wasn't on there. There's one freeway report, but it's not even in the area that this happened. So it's like both of these things just don't exist. It was 1983 to 85 when we had moved from Japan to the Florida Panhandle. Fort Walton Beach, to be exact. The most beautiful community you could imagine. Even though the ocean was only one side of the Panhandle, it felt like we were surrounded by water. There were myriad of ocean-fed lakes and tributaries fed by the Gulf of Mexico, weaving their way around the area. Anywhere in the town was about 5 minutes from the warm sands of a beach. Okaloosa Island was a quick drive, and the entire length of it was like Peter Pan's Pleasure Island, dotted with huge water slides and pina colada-scented surf shops. The beaches there were lined with snow-white sand that melted into the bluest waters you usually only saw in movies. I loved it there. The ocean air, the many low bridges linking different parts of the town over parts of the ocean, the perfect warm weather. I absolutely loved it. The house was almost enough to make me forget that, though. Almost. It wasn't a big house at all, not like the typical haunted houses they make movies about. It wasn't huge and full of dark rooms and basements. It was just the opposite. It was a small one-floor house with 2 bedrooms, one of which I shared with my younger brother. 1 bathroom, a living room, and a kitchen. What we didn't have with money living a military lifestyle was made up for by traveling all over the place and experiencing life in a way most people never get to. So the house was small, but we were happy. It was also on a pretty major street that was fairly busy all day, a stoplight only a block away from us. A very unassuming living situation. There was, however, one small detail my parents had kept from us until we were fully moved in. Across the street there was an enormous brick wall that spanned at least 20 feet high, dressed in dripping green ivy and topped with ornate black iron spikes every 10 feet, the entire length of it, that being at least 5 or 6 blocks. I had thought it was the private property of the wealthy. There were so many of them there. Old mansions owned by older money. They were everywhere, but that was not the case here. No, not at all. That monolithic wall housed not an antiquated home, but an antiquated cemetery, complete with archaic statuary wrought with vines and cracks and small mausoleums for the old money of the city. My brother and I were, of course, completely horrified. But the wall did its job and helped us to forget soon enough, and life continued. One night, we were all watching Night Flight together. I loved music, and my parents, being very young for parents of 2 boys, were a huge influence on my love of rock and pop. Our couch sat in front of the huge living room window that looked out onto the busy street, only facing away from it. At this time of night, traffic was minimal, and any noise was being drowned out by the Yes singing Owner of a Lonely Heart anyway. Still, I heard something over the music, something coming from the street. I instinctively looked over at my mom, and she just kind of shook her head no to me, like she knew what I was thinking. I turned around on the couch anyway, and pushed the curtain aside to see what it was. My mom did the same. I could see the stoplight clearly. The light was red, and there was a woman standing on the corner, looking panicked. A car had pulled up to her, and she started screaming bloody murder, struggling and yelling, while she was being pulled into the car. My mom just squeezed my shoulder. I pulled my head back in to see why my dad wasn't running out there to save her, but he was watching TV with my little brother, both completely unbothered. My brother was playing with some toy, clearly not hearing the screaming, and my dad was just sitting back tapping his foot to the song. I started to say something, but my mother's hand squeezed harder, and I whispered, "But," and she said quietly, "There's nothing to see." I looked back out the window. There was nothing. No car, no woman, nothing. It happened so fast, I was confused. Where did the car go? I didn't hear it peel out, and there wasn't enough time either. I didn't know when the screaming stopped either. It just stopped. I realized that when I was watching the car and the girl, there were no other cars driving by. In those few minutes, no one passed them, and now the street was suddenly very busy. I looked up at my mom, and she said under her breath, "I told you not to look," and gave me this look that said, "Don't tell your father you saw anything." So I didn't. That would be just the beginning of my experiences at that house. At the time that this happened, I was living in Georgia. My home was near Richmond Hill, and I was working as a lifeguard near Hinesville, which is about 45 minutes away. It was the middle of summer, and I had a later shift, ending at around 9 p.m., and I had stayed in Hinesville until about 1 a.m., hanging out with coworkers before heading home. Now, to give you some context, at the time I had a 4-door Honda CR-V. Also, between Hinesville and Richmond, there's pretty much only one road of nothingness, except for one creepy house that, according to some of my friends, was rumored to be a cult house or something, where this really weird family lived secluded away from everyone. At night, that stretch of road gets really dark. There's not a lot of traffic or streetlights, and without a moon in the sky or the light of your car, you'd be pretty much blind until sunrise. Well, it was around 1 a.m. and I was heading home. Stupidly, I had forgotten to get gas before I left, and I was close to empty. I was nervous, but I figured I could make it home. I made it about 5 minutes out of Hinesville before I got the feeling that someone was watching me from the back seat. The feeling was so strong that I slowed down. I know I should have stopped, but there was no traffic except for me. I switched on my phone light, and I physically turned around and looked in the back seat, and in as much of the trunk as I could see, but it was empty. I turned back around, but the feeling stayed and worsened, like somebody was full-on glaring at the back of my head, wanting me to notice them. Because I have the worst luck, at that moment my gas tank light came on, and my tank hit the empty mark. I was still 30 minutes from home. At this point, I started freaking out. I can't tell you why I thought this, but I just knew that if I ran out of gas and was stranded on the side of the road, something bad would happen to me. It doesn't seem logical, I know, but it honestly felt like someone or something was in my back seat, staring at me with just this incredible hatred and will to hurt me, and if my car stopped, they would get their way. So I did the only thing I could think of. I clenched both hands on the wheel and started praying, just begging God to let me get to my house before my car ran out of gas. Now I know this sounds insane, and maybe there's some kind of weird technical explanation for this, because I don't know much about cars. But I swear, as I was asking to make it to my house, I watched my gas light go off and my gas tank meter go up to a quarter of a tank. I still felt like there was something in my backseat staring me down, but it felt less intense. The drive felt like forever, but I made it back to the town that I lived in, and the minute I passed the sign saying that I was now in Richmond Hill, my meter went all the way back down to empty, and my gas tank light came on, and it stayed like that the 5 further minutes it took me to make it to my driveway. The next morning, I talked to my mother about it. For some reason, she thought the thing in my back seat was my grandpa, who had passed away a year earlier and had Alzheimer's. She theorized that he was coming to check up on me, but had scared me because he was still confused in the afterlife. I really don't agree with that. My grandpa was a very loving person. Even when his memory got really bad and he couldn't remember my name, he still remembered me. Rather than saying my name, he said T-ball, because he'd been my T-ball coach when I was really little. Personally, I feel like whatever it was attached to the road and was entirely negative. Either way, I never felt it again, and my car never repeated the gas tank trick. Though after that, I started hanging a cross on my rearview mirror, just in case. This story happened to me about 12 years ago. I was 21 years old, just finished basic training for the Air Force, and I didn't have my tech school for another 6 months, so the Air Force sent me home. While home in Hawaii, my parents decided to take me to Vietnam to visit, as I'm Vietnamese and my mom felt it was important for me to visit the motherland. On the trip, it was my parents, my 4-year-old brother, and my best friend Dan. For most of the trip, we did what normal tourists did. One of our destinations was the city of Kanto. It's a harbor city. Not thinking anything and never really believing in the supernatural, I was also excited to visit historical sites and stay at old hotels. We ended up staying at a hotel that was by a harbor. I don't remember the name of the hotel, but Dan and I shared a hotel room, and my parents and little brother had the next room. I remember going to bed like it was any other ordinary day. I was dreaming, and I saw this figure laying on the bottom edge of my bed. This person was laid in the fetal position. For some reason, my eyes were focused on his feet, then started to slowly move up his body, and then I realized he was naked. Then I saw his face, and at that moment I made eye contact with him, and he stared back at me. Once that happened, I began to have sleep paralysis. I couldn't move. I could hear myself screaming, but nothing was coming out. I kept screaming, "Dan! Dan!" but he could not hear me. So I told myself to calm down and try to burst out, and that's what I did. It worked. I jumped up and woke Dan up. The first thing my friend asked me was why I was so pale. It looked like I'd seen a ghost, he said. I told him what happened. It freaked him out, and we ran to my mom's room and woke them up. My parents asked me what happened. As I was explaining to them what I had experienced, the curtains covering their window began to sway back and forth, and the lights in the room started flickering like crazy. My dad, who's a total skeptic, yelled, "Leave my family alone!" And it just stopped. After several minutes of talking and trying to understand what happened, we went to bed. Dan and I slept in their room on the extra bed. The next day, we woke up and my parents were already downstairs eating breakfast. When I went downstairs, my mom greeted me and told me she had someone for me to talk to. It was the hotel manager. She had told him what had happened, and he told me, "Yeah, it happens a lot to people who are in the military." I was confused and asked why. He said this hotel had been built on top of what used to be an American hospital during the Vietnam War. And he said that they were trying to reach out to their comrades. I became a believer in the supernatural then, and have been ever since. I work as a service manager at a Chipotle that is rather understaffed. As the manager, I'm the last one out, and due to staffing, that's usually pretty late. To make matters worse, I commute by bike, so I like to get changed when I finish all my work. This means I'm usually alone for at least 15 minutes in the basement of a strip mall, well after everyone else is gone. From the entire area, not just the restaurant. Because of this, I've heard strange noises and felt a presence behind me. And others have even mentioned being pushed down the stairs, or have reported things being thrown down. We have cameras that look down the staircase, and trust me, it's pretty weird to watch what happens. But the worst was that one night I was here alone until 2 a.m. doing a full inventory. The last employee left at 12:45. The building was locked down, and there wasn't a single other person in the entire strip. But by 1:15, I heard a man and a woman arguing. The sounds were coming from the solid concrete walls. Around 1:30, I heard breathing coming up toward me, so I slammed the office door shut. That didn't stop the breath from coming up to my neck. I could feel pressure on my shoulders. That subsided at 1:50. At 2:10, I was getting changed in the storage room and took my bike out to set the alarm. The second I set the alarm, I hear the sounds of stomping boots running through the kitchen toward the back door, where I was currently in the process of getting out of there. I have never left a building so fast in all my life. This happened over 30 years ago, so I'll explain the incident as best as I can remember. When I was 3, my grandma on my maternal side died of a heart attack. While at the funeral, the adults were outside talking, smoking cigarettes, etc. Myself, my older brother, and another family member close to our age were told to stay inside to keep us out of conversations that we didn't need to hear, according to my parents. Well, the other family member convinced my brother that locking me in the viewing room, with those red lights over the coffin on, was a good idea. Once they locked me in, the other family member called through the door that Grandma needed to take me with her because I was her favorite. I screamed and cried as loud as my little self could, and some adults took me outside to my parents. I was told that they were just playing, and that even though Grandma loved me, she was never going to take me away. They were doing their best to soothe a very upset 3-year-old. Later that year, we moved 2 states away from there. One night in the new house, 4 years later, I woke up in the middle of the night. According to my mom, this was very unusual. I heard a song that only my grandma sang to me. I sat up looking around, and I see the lid on my old toy box opening by itself. Once it was fully open, I saw what looked like my grandma standing slowly from inside that box. She turned slowly and creepily around to look at me. I was frozen in place. I couldn't cry, I couldn't scream, I couldn't even move. Then she started walking toward me. She stepped close to the bed and said, "I came to get you. You were always my favorite, and now I want you to be with me." Somehow I found my voice and screamed. My mom came running in, and just before she got to my room, my grandma said, "I'll come back for you again," and vanished. My mother came in, asking who I was talking to. I told her everything. My mom let me sleep in the living room for a few nights while she got rid of my toy box. The toy box was the last thing my grandma had ever given me before she died. To this day, I have no idea what happened. All I know is that wasn't Grandma. My name is Luna, and I'm 35 years old, and I'm a hospice nurse. I've been a hospice nurse for the last 10 years. This is a story about a young woman I took care of that I became very close to. The patient in question was 23 years old and was dying of liver cancer. She was given about 6 months when she was told she was terminal and was put on hospice. I started going to her house twice a week at first, and we really liked each other. As she started slowly going downhill, I started coming more and more until I was there every day. Most of the time, we would just sit and talk. She was a very pretty girl with long black hair and blue eyes. She was very athletic and active before she got cancer, so not being able to do things for herself or get up and around without help was very hard for her. She always wore a minty-smelling perfume, which I liked very much. I was with her the day she died, and that was a very hard day for me. I got home pretty late that day, and I made dinner for myself and sat down in the living room in front of the television. I had been sitting there for about 5 minutes when I smelled a minty smell that was just like my patient's perfume. Then I heard a cough and a female voice call my name. I looked over toward the kitchen, and there was my patient standing beside the kitchen counter. She just looked at me, and she was smiling, and then she waved and disappeared. I think it was just her way of saying she was okay. Sometimes to this day, I still feel like she's watching over me. Sometimes I still smell her perfume, especially if I've had a hard day. I have absolutely no memory of this experience, but my mom does, and she told me the story. I was a little over 2 years old and had just started to walk on my own when this event took place. My mom only told me this story about 3 years ago when I was 32 and about to get married. My mother was raised in a very tiny fundamentalist Christian community and had no belief in the paranormal. She believed that our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something like that. Ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits to haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, she still sounded terrified as she told me this. This woman, who always talks way too loudly, was literally whispering by the end of it. And she was white as a sheet. I believed her completely, and I still do. My mom never talks about stuff like this. I'm just glad that I can't remember it. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother, who we'll call Victor. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies. My parents decided to move to a rambling old 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Ohio for more room for the family. It was way out in the sticks and took almost an hour to get to the town from there. My mom said the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "Don't like mean house, ugly house, don't like, scary house, mama, don't like." My mom says this behavior was extremely out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she chalked it up to the stress of the move. Now this house was ramshackle and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was to the far rear of the house, and until recently before we moved in, still had a working ancient wood-burning cooking stove against the back wall. This had caught the back wall on fire a couple of months before we moved in, causing a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed, so my young, broke parents got a very cheap rental agreement. Gotta love the 80s. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord claimed it had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed that the only fire damage left was in the kitchen, since it had been the worst and was beyond his skill level. Either way, the landlord was adamant that that room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I would have looked 100%. I know all of this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were pictures of us in and around the farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both of my parents have told me that it did give them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, my mother and I were in the yard with our Pit Doberman mix, Boss. She was hanging laundry and I was just rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too silent, Boss started going absolutely ape from surprisingly far away, About 500 yards from the house on the left, there was a small duck pond. Boss was in between the two, running toward my mom, then turning and running back to the pond, barking frantically the whole time. That's when my mom saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond. She took off toward the water at full speed. Boss beat her there and dragged me out of the water himself. Thanks, pupper. Love you. Although my mom was confused as to how I'd gotten so far so fast, and how I had ended up in the center of the pond, since it was way over my head and I couldn't swim, she figured she just underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from now on. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Boss was outside, Victor was asleep in his crib, and I was in my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran up from the side of the kitchen, so my mom said she could listen to hear us crying or fussing while she cooked. My mom said that no longer than 15 minutes after the last time she looked in on us kids, Boss started going crazy again in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor's still sleeping. Every baby gate is shut and locked, but I am not in my room. A frenzied search revealed that I wasn't in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning caused my mom to rush outside to see what he was trying to tell her this time. She said he was running circles in the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she got outside, he took off toward the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around and bark at my mother and wait for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her almost 1.5 miles out onto the dirt road that separated our property from the neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of the rocky drive. She said what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into the trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said that she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, tarps, tires, and other debris. The miasma was emanating most strongly from these junkyard cairns. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket, where the tree cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bones and rotted chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently, our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the remains in at least one of the few thick stands of trees around. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there, looking around like I was confused, surrounded by carnage. She said I didn't seem scared or anything, I was just standing. She rushed over to me, and after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, began questioning me on why I was there and how I'd gotten there. Keep in mind that although my mother said I started speaking at a very young age, I still didn't have much of a vocabulary. She said that I told her, with that serious look that only small children can give, that the children had brought me there. Shitting her pants a little at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her, through the kitchen, get me from upstairs, walk right back past her on the way down the stairs and out with me all the way over here, she demanded to know what children and where the hell they were now. I looked at her dead serious and told her, the ones that live with us in the room at the top of the stairs. I don't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she started asking all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there, staring at her, with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said this same pattern held true every other time she brought it up to me, so she was always left wondering, and immediately began hounding my dad about moving closer to town. While the incident with me getting to the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. My mother is adamant that me being in the hidden slaughter yard that day was flat impossible. She says there's no way I could have even known it was out there, much less have had the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs, past her, and end up almost 2 miles down the road, all in under 15 minutes. I was only 2 and as slow and clumsy as most toddlers. As I said, she's still shaken by it after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis, but haven't decided if I really want to remember. Maybe it's better to let it be a mystery, because whatever those things were, I really don't think they were children.
I have 4 kids. I know that I have 4 kids, but recently I just feel like there should be another one, but they're missing. When we go out, I head count and I get flustered because I can't find the extra one. I have to consciously remind myself that there are only 4, but my heart just doesn't believe it. I had just put it down as one of those weird feelings and I pushed it aside. Then, my parents sent money to my kids. They sent $100 to each kiddo. They sent me $500. I called them and asked them why they had put in so much, and they were confused and said that they told me they were sending $100 per child. I reminded them that I only have 4 kids. They were silent for a moment and then just kind of laughed and said they must be getting old because they thought there were 5. Then tonight, my daughter walked into the lounge room. She looked around and said, "I know we're all here, but our family feels small." My son agreed. I hadn't said anything to anybody about my feelings lately because they already think I'm ancient and forgetful at 40. I don't really know what this means, but it's definitely strange. And apparently it's not just me. Does anyone else ever have these feelings? Was my other kid lost in a glitch? I don't know what it could be. Last year, I was off work for 5 months because of tumors in my throat. After surgery, I started a new job, and my first week back at work, I was cashing through a lady who had 2 carts full of stuff, so obviously I was helping her for a while. She had her daughter with her, who was probably 12 to 14, and was very high on the autism spectrum. She wasn't nonverbal per se, but she apparently didn't like to talk to strangers at all, and generally preferred not to speak whatsoever. Her mom said that there are only 3 people she ever speaks to, otherwise she ignores everybody. So anyway, she's talking to me the whole time, telling me about the balloon she's getting and how she likes going to stores, which had her mom so happy and surprised she was trying not to cry. The girl was talking to me the entire time, and I was honored. Then, suddenly the girl asks, "So how's your throat feeling?" Her mom looks at her and says, "That's such an odd question to ask someone. Why are you asking her that?" The mom laughs, and the girl asks me again. I told her it's feeling pretty good, and I asked how hers is. She said, "Mine's good too, but I was worried about you." It was so weird, and her mom's like, "Sorry, I don't know why she's being so odd." I told her, "No, it's okay. It's just super ironic because I just had surgery on my throat in April." The girl goes, "Yeah, I know. That's why I asked." The mom freaked out, thinking her daughter must be sensitive or have a connection to the world that we can't understand. I have no idea what it was, if it was a glitch or an encounter with someone who was psychic, but it was really strange and kind of beautiful. I wondered if maybe she knew me in another dimension, or maybe she's just in tune with another dimension. Maybe time is more fluid to her and she can know these things. Maybe another me met her before my surgery. Maybe it was just coincidence, though. Who knows? But it was interesting nonetheless. I was 18 and living in a big house in a small village with my mom. We had a large garden with a designated area for our 8 rabbits. Every evening, we would take turns to go out to feed the animals before it got dark. However, this particular evening, we had arrived home so late that it was already darker than usual. We agreed to feed the rabbits together because it can be quite creepy out in the garden alone at night. I went to the bathroom and told my mom that I would meet her out there in a minute. When I was done, I went straight to the garden, where I heard my mom call, "Jess?" as she heard the door close behind me. I answered, yes, and I saw her upper body pop up from behind the trampoline to make sure it was me. There were no lights outside. However, the combination of the moon, stars, and distant low light of the motorway was enough to illuminate the area to be able to see quite clearly. I was only around 10 meters from her, so I could see her face and her very distinct big curly blonde hair. She said, okay, and bent back down behind the trampoline to continue feeding the rabbits. I looked down at the grass as I made my way to the bottom of the garden, so as not to step in any holes dug out by the rabbits during their runaround time. As I made my way down, I spoke to her about how naughty one of the rabbits was acting that day. It took me no longer than 7 seconds to get to the rabbit area. As I approached behind the trampoline where the rabbits' hutches were, I looked up and expected to see my mom standing there, as I had just seen and spoken to her a few moments before. She wasn't there. I looked around for a few seconds thinking she might be hiding in order to give me a playful scare, when, to my horror, I heard the back door of the house close. I looked up quickly and saw my mom walking out into the garden. I immediately speed-walked up that garden toward her so fast with total terror in my eyes. She asked me what was the matter, and I just said, I'm never going down there again. I just saw you and spoke to you, and by the time I got down there, you were gone. Then you walked out the door. She looked at me wide-eyed and assured me that she had been in the kitchen getting her shoes on the entire time. She's not skeptical at all about these kinds of things, and from the look on my face, she could tell that I had experienced quite a scare, so she believed me straight away. We were both quite nervous about going back down there. However, the rabbits needed feeding, so we had a nervous laugh and cautiously went down to feed the rabbits together. We had a look around, and there was nothing there. I don't know who or what I spoke to in my garden. Maybe it was a glitch in the Matrix and my mom from another timeline appeared to feed my rabbits. Or perhaps some darker forces were at work that night. I've read a little bit about doppelgangers and how some people recognize them as warnings of death. I don't know if it's related, but not long after this incident, half the rabbits dropped dead within a few days of each other. I still can't explain what happened.
This isn't exactly a horrifying story, so don't get too disappointed if you're not terrified. For background, I'm a 15-year-old Irish fella called Ross. I go to school in Ireland, and I'm now in 3rd year. At the start of the 2nd year, I knew a fella that joined the school. I was in charge of showing him around, and we've been good friends ever since. He is Portuguese, and his name is Tiago. I'll call him Tig for the story. His school bag is a fairly small, bright red bag. He's a little bit shorter than me, and his hair is quite short and brown in color. One day, I was upstairs in my school. It was break time, and I was going to my group's usual spot. I turned a corner and I saw Tig walking along the hallway. This was weird because at the distance I was from him, I would have seen him come up the stairs. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I sped up to catch up to him. There was another corner coming up. He rounded it and I followed suit, except he wasn't there. There was a staircase going back down and 2 bathrooms, one for lads and one for lassies, but no Tig. Considering how close behind him I was, he would have had to have sprinted towards and then jumped down the stairs or jogged into one of the bathrooms. If he went for the stairs, I would have heard it, so I figured he was in the bathroom. I sat at the bench and waited. Tig was the first other person in our group to arrive. He rounded the corner and set his bag down. The realization hit me hard. He wasn't in the bathroom, and whatever or whoever I had followed was not Tig, even though it looked just like him. Same backpack and everything. I asked him if he had already been up there, to which he replied he hadn't. He had no reason to lie. Now, I know what you're thinking. It was someone else. First of all, the person that I saw looked the exact same as my friend from the back. Second of all, no one else in the school has that bag. At least I've never seen anyone else with it. And third, the only place the person could have gone without sprinting down the stairs, which I probably would have caught a glimpse of anyway, would be the bathroom. No one ever came out of the bathroom. At least nobody that I didn't watch go into it. Finally, my friend is a fairly distinct character. Not many people have the same body build as he does. Like I said at the start, it's not exactly terrifying, but I do believe it to be a glitch in the Matrix. Howth is a little village near Canterbury and Surrey, out on the old marshes that were once the Wonsum Channel. A few years ago in 2014, my landscaping company were called to a job in a beautiful house there. The house was a converted barn and had been bought by the new owners, who wanted some work to be done there before moving in, as is often the case. So the first step was to visit the property and take a look to come up with a price for the job. There was a great deal of land surrounding the property, with extensive gardens that had fallen into a state of disrepair. After visiting the property, I returned, saying that the place gave me the creeps, and that although it was empty and isolated several hundred yards from the next dwelling, it felt like I was being watched. Obviously, everybody laughed at me. I priced the job, which was a big one, and would need us to be on site for about 5 days, and forgot about the whole thing. As it turned out, we were given the contract for the garden clearance and various tree works, and we booked in for a few weeks' time. When we arrived on site, there was a crew of builders there already, who were working inside the house and had been living there for a couple of weeks while they carried out the renovations. When we arrived, we said our hellos, and John asked what they thought of the house. The reply was, "It's a lovely place, but it's haunted as hell." We laughed and asked why they thought that, and they told us that all night they could hear banging coming from empty rooms. Their tools were being moved around. They heard whispering, and one had even received a phone call from a distant voice that he couldn't understand, from a number that was just all zeros. He showed us the call record to prove it on his mobile phone. Interested, but still not entirely convinced, we got on with our work. Joe told us that the back courtyard garden gave him the willies, but apart from that, day one was uneventful. On day two, it was quiet in the morning. Then, in the afternoon, I went inside for coffee. While I was there were knocking sounds coming from one of the back rooms. Nobody was in there, but it could well have been someone in one of the garden areas knocking against the wooden walls from outside while doing some kind of job. But then there was a sound like wallpaper being unrolled or a poster falling off of a wall, something like that. It came from the hall. Then, out of the hall, a shadow shot through the kitchen and out the front door. I was alone in the house at the time, and after looking from every angle, the only way the shadow could have been cast was by the kitchen lights in the middle of the room, but there was nothing there to cast it. I was starting to become a believer. On day 3, Paul, one of the builders, was having an argument with somebody on the phone. When he hung up, he said, "I can't believe that. The driver from the skip company says he won't come here to pick up the skip unless we can promise that there's somebody on site to meet him, because he reckons that he saw something here when he dropped the skip off before we got here, and he says that it's definitely haunted." When he did arrive, he said that when he dropped the skip off the first time, he knew the place was empty, but he saw somebody moving around in there. And while he was unloading the skip, the radio in his lorry came on with a loud load of static. Day 4 was quiet, apart from the knocking and banging, which we'd all gotten used to by then, even though it was louder than before, and definitely not one of us messing about. On day 5, a guy turned up to put in a new TV aerial, and that involved some wiring being fitted in the back room where most of the noises had come from. A few hours in, he was having coffee with everyone else in the kitchen, and he said that he'd be glad when he was done, because that room was creeping him out. He said that he was sure he kept hearing somebody walking around in there, but there was nobody inside the house, let alone in that room. The final thing that happened while we were working there was that another contractor turned up to do some light fittings. He parked outside the house. While he was in there, his van radio came on blaring with really loud static, just like the skip driver had said happened to him when he was there before. A few weeks after we'd been there, the new owners had moved in, and John and I went over to visit them and settle up the bill. John was curious and asked the owner if he was enjoying living there. He obviously read between the lines a little bit. Maybe he'd already been asked about the place by one of the other contractors, and he responded by saying, "It's a beautiful house, but I must say, it takes on a completely different feeling at night. It's not such a nice place after it gets dark." We returned to work there a couple more times on smaller jobs, but as the clients were living there full time by then, we didn't spend much time in the actual house itself. On one occasion, we were in the kitchen in the evening, having a cup of tea with the owner, when from the back room there was a huge crash, like a wardrobe being pushed over. The owner just put his finger up and whispered, "Please just pretend you didn't hear that. We don't want the children to be scared." We do a lot of work on repossessed houses, no pun intended, and houses going through probate, so I've visited a lot of empty properties, often where the owner has recently died, and in over 10 years, I have never been creeped out by a place like I was that one. This story is definitely not the only paranormal experience that I've had, but it certainly was a unique one. I have a guardian ghost, or at least I think so. As long as I can remember, there have been weird things happening in my house. As a child, my parents purely blamed it on my imagination, but it continued and got even more visible during my teenage years. While a lot of the things that happened belong to another story, I'll concentrate on the very nice dude that seems to live there with us. He made his first appearance when my step-siblings and I were about 5 years old. I remember vividly playing hide and seek with them, walking into my room and seeing a ball rolling across the floor from behind the sofa. But nobody was hiding in that room. When I mentioned this to them years later, they confirmed that they also had had this feeling of another person playing with us. I've always heard footsteps in our house, up the stairs at night, behind me while walking up or down them. It was quite common. Then it started to become the whole house. When I was about 13, I used to spend about 2 hours home alone every day after school until my parents got home. Usually I would spend this time in my room. What would happen every day is that I would hear somebody unlock the front door and walk into my living room. And every day I would go downstairs thinking that one of my parents must have come home, but nobody would ever be there. It got me so paranoid that I started locking the door to my room when I was home alone, thinking somebody must be in the house with me. Then I started to hear breathing at night, in my room, like right next to my head when I was lying in bed. The first time it happened, I got so scared that I stuffed my blanket above my head. The next morning I told my mom about it, who said that I must have just heard my stepdad snoring in their room. That would mean that I had heard that through multiple closed doors between our rooms. Sure, Jan. Anyway, the breathing started to get more and more common. Not every night, but quite often. Then there was the first incident that now, looking back, makes me think that this paranormal roommate had tried to protect me all along. When I was 14, I had a friend. As it turned out, she was a very toxic and backstabbing person, but I hadn't realized that yet. She was over at my house after school, and we were upstairs playing SingStar on my PlayStation 2. My mom came up to inform us that she would go to the store to get some groceries, and that we would be alone there for about a half an hour. This was okay with us. We waited until we heard her lock the front door, and then we closed the door to the room we were in and started to sing to all of our favorite 2000 hits. That was until my friend suddenly stopped and started staring at the door. I paused the game and asked her what was wrong, and that's when she just turned pale and told me that somebody had just knocked on the door very loudly. I hadn't heard anything, so I told her that she must have just heard something else. We continued our game, and about a minute later, the same thing happened. My friend stands there, just frozen, completely panicked, telling me that she needs to leave the room immediately because something is trying to get inside. Great logic, by the way. But I, who still hasn't heard anything, slowly opened the door. Nothing was there. My friend wanted to go downstairs, which we then did. But when we got to the middle of the staircase, she starts screaming. Of course, both of us start running, me being scared because she's screaming like bloody hell. Our first instinct was to open the back door and run outside, where we waited for my mom to come home, as my friend refused to set foot in the house again. When she calmed down a bit, she told me that when walking down the stairs, somebody started talking right next to her, right into her ear. Needless to say, she never visited again, which was good knowing now all the things she did later on. Anyway, I was very paranoid still that somebody might be in our house. Right under my window was our back door, which I didn't trust one bit when it came to protecting us from an attempted break-in. Every now and then, when I was lying on my bed at night, I would get afraid of any noises coming from that direction, because oftentimes it sounded like somebody was trying to open it. But anytime I got scared by it, this breathing would start again. And eventually it didn't feel scary anymore. It started to feel like somebody was trying to comfort me, trying to tell me that everything was okay, and that I wasn't alone. Which, looking back on it now, is not so comforting, because I was alone, but I digress. After what happened with my friend, I was glad to change schools. At my new school, I avoided topics like ghosts and stuff. I wanted to use the opportunity of making new friends without being the girl with the haunted house. Also, a part of me was thinking straight enough to acknowledge that the breathing only occurred when I was feeling scared, and might just be some kind of mental mechanism to calm myself down. That was until I had a sleepover with two of my friends at age 17. For reference, my room was kind of long. On the one side it had my bed, and on the other it had a sofa. There were like 3 meters between them. So Sarah slept on the sofa, while Ella slept in my bed next to me. Next to my bed was a rocking chair that my grandpa had once gotten from a garage sale. Keep in mind that I hadn't told them anything that had happened to me in the last couple of years. Since it was the first time having them stay over, I wanted to be a good host and asked them how they slept. Ella didn't say anything, but Sarah said, "Okay, I know this is gonna sound super weird, but I couldn't sleep for most of the night. It was like somebody was just breathing into my face, but when I looked, nobody was there." I was shocked, because this confirmed everything that I thought I had just imagined. Around this time, the thing with hearing the steps got worse. So much worse that my mom started asking me if I was jumping around my room in the middle of the night. My stepdad asked on several occasions what in the world I was doing in the kitchen at 3 a.m., because he kept hearing somebody walk around downstairs. I hadn't been doing either of those things. About 2 years had passed since the sleepover with my friends, when Ella and I were talking to a friend of ours who had just gotten his first apartment. He told us to come over later on, and I jokingly asked him if he had any furniture yet, or if we would have to sit on the floor. He then proudly told us that he even had a very cool rocking chair. That's when Ella told us that she hates rocking chairs because she had a really creepy experience regarding one. Our friend wanted to know what happened, so she started telling her story. "Well, I spent the night somewhere, and there was a rocking chair in the room. When I woke up in the middle of the night, there was this tall stranger sitting on it, just watching me sleep. I was confused and said, 'That's so creepy. Where did that happen?' She said, 'It was at your place.' And no, it wasn't my stepdad. Ella knows my stepdad, and he isn't that tall. And also, he wouldn't just be sitting in our room in the middle of the night. I wanted to get more information about it, but she refused to ever talk about it again afterwards. That's why she had been so quiet that next morning." The following years continued as usual. I even started communicating with this ghost. Whenever I got scared and heard the breathing, it always made me feel calm, so I started thanking him for letting me know that everything was okay. And whenever I thanked him, the breathing stopped. I once saw the guy that Ella mentioned too. I was walking down the hall past an open door, and there he was, just standing. A tall man with some kind of hat. I could only see the silhouette. And I left as fast as I could because it was still kind of creepy. Later on, after finally believing the stories that I had told them, my parents became more aware of everything. Even after I moved out, my stepdad continued to tell me that there was some ghost guy living with them. Like, yeah, I know, I've been telling you for years. On the rare occasions that I am at my parents' house, he rarely makes his presence known to me. Sometimes I can see a shadow passing by an open door or something small, but my mom still sees him. She just decided to ignore him. We're still not really sure what this could be. I can rule out any deceased relatives as there aren't many, and nobody has ever died in the house. My parents built the house, so we were the first to live there. I thought that maybe he was just attached to me, and that when I moved he might follow, but he never did. I also don't think he's attached to the rocking chair, because it started before I ever placed that in my room. I guess he just thought it was comfortable? I don't know. Still, I hope someday I find out where he came from and why he's in our house. My best friend, I'll call her Gray, and I wanted to hang out, so we decided to go for a hike. I chose a reservation that I had been to multiple times before so that we could still have hope of navigating through the long trails in case we got lost. In hindsight, it was a pretty strange decision to go hiking, considering that it was mid-February in New England and it was still pretty cold out. This day in particular was especially foggy and colder than we had expected. We took the bus to the northern entrance of the reservation and headed toward the southern entrance, about a 4.5-hour-long trail. This was Gray's first time visiting the reservation, so she was attempting to take photos along the way. I say attempting because whenever she took her phone out, she would manage to snap a few photos before her phone would shut off and restart, probably because of the cold. My phone wouldn't even turn on at all. Nearing the end of the trail, we come across an extremely picturesque setting. A large, barren tree with a wooden swing attached to the largest branch on the edge of a frozen, foggy pond. The first people we see since we arrived was a man swinging a little girl, probably about 4 years old, wearing a bright pink jacket. We get closer, and Gray manages to take a handful of photos before her phone repeats the cycle of death. She tells me that she wants to swing after they leave, so we wait patiently, giving them enough space to not ruin their moment. Not even 10 minutes into waiting, we notice that the man has stopped pushing the little girl, and instead is just standing there, staring straight at us without any expression on his face. Gray and I turn around to avoid the creepy eye contact for a few seconds. And when we turn back around, the man is coming straight at us on an all-black unicycle. Gray screams, and right before he would crash into us, he makes a sharp turn straight into the woods. I will never forget how creepy this man's face was. He had absolutely no emotion at all, and literally looked pale as a ghost, almost green in the face. We look back at the little girl to see her struggling to run after him, eventually disappearing into the woods as well. Gray and I debated on going after the little girl for a while, but decided not to since neither of our phones were turning on, and we still had about a half an hour to reach the southern exit of the reservation. I start pushing Gray on the swing, and as we're trying to dissect what just happened and where this man got a unicycle from, something across the pond catches my attention. I can barely see it through the fog, but quickly realize from the bright pink color that the little girl was watching us from between the trees. What makes this even crazier is that the man and the little girl disappeared into the woods heading east, and the other side of the pond was west of where Gray and I were. This little girl did not have nearly enough time to have gone all the way around without either of us noticing. I pointed out to Gray, and she immediately jumps off the swing, and we both start running to the exit without exchanging a word until we're in the clear. We walked about another 45 minutes until we reached civilization again and found a place to go eat. We go in and Gray plugs her phone into an outlet so that it can turn back on, and we look through all the photos. All the photos from the day are there, except the last 4 photos that she took of the man and the little girl. In their place were just plain black thumbnails with an error message that read, "File not found." To this day, we can't make any sense of that situation. I went back to that reservation several times afterwards. I tried avoiding that pond at all costs. The one time I did revisit the pond area was because of a dare with a group of friends, only to discover something equally as strange. It was about 9 p.m. and completely dark, and there was a group of about 20 to 30 people having a picnic in what looked like colonial-era clothing. We kind of creeped on them for a few minutes and decided to just head back before they noticed us. But the fact that they were having a picnic without any sort of lights or lanterns in the middle of the woods was pretty weird. I'm still not really sure what's going on at that pond, but I don't think I'll be going back anytime soon. So the other night, my boyfriend, daughter, who's 3.5, and I were walking in the cemetery a few blocks from our house. We drove because we wanted maximum walking time with the toddler. We planned to play Pokemon Go. We entered through the main entrance, and after a few steps, I started feeling nauseous and worried. Anxious. I didn't know why, so I just ignored it. We wanted to check out the huge headstones toward the middle, so we headed that way. We noticed a car parked with its lights off, no front license plate, passenger and back doors wide open, and the man is halfway in the back seat. He's parked on one side of the big headstones, which ended up being priests. We walked through and the guy noticed us. He closed the doors that were open, then went around to the driver's side and got in the car. He sat there and just watched us. So we veered away from him and went down a different path. My daughter all of a sudden says, "They're so loud." I said, "Who?" My daughter goes, "The rocks. They're talking to me." My mouth drops open. We didn't tell her anything about the cemetery or headstones or what the place even is. She has no idea what they are other than big rocks. We ended up leaving, and as soon as we drove away, my nausea eased up. I told my boyfriend about feeling sick, and he freaked out and explained EMF to me. Creepy. We went to the store and passed the cemetery on the way home again. The man's car was still there. He left after we pulled down the street that we lived on. We've had one other paranormal experience with her before. This was the second time that the afterlife, ghosts, spirits, something, showed up to say that it exists, and it's confirmed for me. Later that night, she started talking about the rocks again and said that they were watching us. I asked her what they looked like, and she said, shadows. She said they looked like this, and then proceeded to make a worried expression. She told me that they couldn't walk with us and that they had to stay by the rocks. I don't know if the spirits were warning us about that man, or maybe there's just something not so good at that cemetery. But either way, it was a really interesting experience.